Dodging the bull wasn't the hard part. With his superior physical stats and a class that excelled in both agility and raw power, Velik could stay ahead of the monster with ease. He could run circles around it, bait its charges, and dance just beyond its reach. But that wouldn't be enough. If the rest of his team started landing hits while he just dodged around, the bull would eventually redirect its rage onto them. And that, Velik knew, would be a disaster. He had to hurt it, badly, enough that its focus stayed glued to him, no matter what the others did. But at the same time, he couldn't outright kill it. That would defeat the whole point of the guild's group exam. Why am I even doing this again? He thought bitterly. With a mental sigh, Velik allowed his spear to unfurl from around his forearm, the smooth coil unwrapping like a snake into his hand. Thanks to shape-shifting, it was as versatile as it was lethal, capable of reforming mid-battle. For this fight, he gave it a long, narrow profile with a needlepoint tip and a razor edge. Quick slashes, deep punctures, steady bleeding. It would do the job. He darted in and whipped the blade across the bull's snout, carving a crimson line into its hide. Black blood welled up immediately. Velik pivoted away in one fluid motion, feet skimming the ground as he leapt to the side just before the bull's horns slashed past. Could have ended this already, he thought. One good thrust through the eye, straight into the brain. But no, that wasn't the assignment. Arrows started peppering the beast's flanks. Most stuck in a muscle, but missed anything vital. Millie barked orders to the archer, some pudgy recruit whose aim Velik wouldn't trust with a dartboard, urging him to target the leg joints. Like that's going to happen, Velik thought dryly. That guy couldn't hit a door frame with both hands and a map. The bull skidded in a wide arc, tearing furrows in the earth as it tried to pivot for another charge. Velik retreated, not from fear, but to avoid catching an arrow in the spine if the archer decided to test his luck again. Behind the beast, Millie and Lesta were closing in. Velik kept the bull turning, running it in a slow spiral. It was easy to maintain its attention with constant pain, needle-thin punctures in the eyes, slashes across the snout, stabs that nicked the inside of the mouth. The beast was locked onto him. The others? Practically invisible to it. Until now. Velik's eyes widened. No, not from behind. Split-tailed bulls weren't named for their horns. They had two tails, each ending in a thick, bony whip that could snap bones and crush ribs. The tails looked unassuming at first, limp, almost decorative. But they were lethal. Lesta didn't know that. She sprinted forward, twin daggers drawn, clearly planning to vault onto the bull's back. The tails reacted before Velik could shout a warning. One lashed across Lesta's face with a sickening crack. The other went for Millie, who managed to abort her leap at the last second and skid back, eyes wide. To her credit, Millie scrambled to Lesta's side immediately, trying to drag her to safety. And she might have succeeded, too. Velik kept the bull's attention. He slashed and jabbed, turning its head left and right, bouncing the spearhead off its horns when necessary to steer it like a puppet. But he knew the pattern, knew what was coming. The bull dropped its front half low to the ground. Velik's breath caught. "Back kick," he shouted. Too late. Its hind legs flexed. A burst of power surged through them, a skill activation. Velik recognized the signs. The hooves alone could crush a man's chest. With a skill behind them, they'd pulverize. He saw it, Millie crouched beside Lesta, head low, arms reaching. She's going to die. He could have stopped it, if Dusk had fallen. If Duskbound were active, he'd be fast enough. But that wasn't a strength he could reveal. No one outside of Torwin and the guild master knew Velik wasn't fully human, and he planned to keep it that way. Still, he had options. The ring on his finger, Twilight Bond, was enchanted with darkness. 1 minute of simulated dusk. 1 minute of peak power. But even activating that would raise questions. He already stood out. Already drew too many stares. Fine. He didn't need it. Instead, he let shape-shifting widen his spearhead into a thick, cleaving blade. Then, just before the bull kicked, he moved. With perfect timing, Velik brought the weapon down hard, splitting the bull's skull cleanly between the horns. It hit brain. Deep. Black blood exploded down its face. The beast collapsed with a thunderous crash, the ground shaking as it hit the earth belly first. The hooves never kicked. You have helped slay a split-tail bull, level 25. Velik exhaled slowly and walked around the body, his face unreadable. Millie was crouched over Lesta, who lay dazed but breathing. The tail strike had knocked her out cold. Millie's eyes were still wide, but she looked up at Velik with something like disbelief. Behind them, the archer sagged against a tree, his final arrow dangling uselessly from his fingers. "Well," Velik muttered, "that could have gone worse." Later, "You fail," said Peveril, voice flat. He didn't even bother to address the rest. They'd already passed. Velik blinked. "Excuse me." The four stood in a line before the instructors. Lesta leaned against Millie, still woozy but upright thanks to a cheap healing potion. The crisis had passed. Peveril crossed his arms. "Your job was to keep the bull's attention. You failed. It attacked your teammates." "I didn't fail," Velik replied, jaw tight. "They approached from behind. A basic mistake. They ignored the bull's known capabilities. You were supposed to control the fight." Velik forced a slow breath. "I did. When things went south, I saved them. I ended the threat." "That's not the point," Peveril said, his sneer deepening. "This was a team test. Everyone else worked together. You played lone wolf and almost got two of them killed." Velik's fists clenched. Must not stab the instructor. Must not stab the instructor. Some of the other instructors looked uncomfortable, but none spoke up. "Out here," Peveril's word was law. "If it was so bad," Velik said coldly, "why didn't any of the instructors intervene?" That earned him a withering glare. "I followed the assignment," he continued. "They didn't. I salvaged the situation, and you know it. If anyone failed, it was." And that right there, Peveril cut in, is exactly why you're not fit for this guild. You still think you did everything right. His tone turned final. "The grade stands. Fail. Now get off my field." Velik stared at him, the rage simmering behind his eyes like banked fire. Then he turned, said nothing, and walked away. The Cravel Guild Hall wasn't at all what Velik had imagined when he'd first arrived. In his head, it had been something out of a story. An enormous lodge with timber walls, roaring fireplaces, and a scent of roasted meat drifting between long tables where hunters boasted of their kills and swapped tales over mugs of ale. Trophies would line the walls. Wyvern fangs, dire bear claws, even a scaled hide or two. What he found was an office. The Monster Hunters Guild, as it turned out, was a business first. The Guild Hall was just a glorified administration center. Paperwork ruled the floors. Clerks buzzed behind wooden counters, scribes hunched over scrolls in a sprawling library, and glass cases protected ancient tomes of monster anatomy and territorial charts. There were queues for job postings, counters for payment claims, and even a separate line for transferring large sums of Dekarmos through bank-issued credits. It was cold, functional, efficient, and utterly devoid of soul. Ironically, the hunters themselves were the only splash of chaos in the place. Grizzled men and women in battered armor or enchanted robes, each one uniquely eccentric in both style and scent. Velik fit right in, if not in manner, then certainly in appearance. His cloak, black and patterned like raven feathers, flowed over deep navy leather armor laced with enchantments. The jewelry scattered across his fingers, neck, and wrists glittered faintly with power, each piece a relic from a champion he'd killed. And yet, despite everything he'd achieved, he stood near the bottom of the guild's hierarchy. All because of red tape. Torwin had helped cut through most of it. His sponsorship got Velik through the door and skipped the worst of the initiation process. But then Torwin had been punished, shipped off on some drawn-out mission to appease Jensen's noble father, who'd sued the guild for a breach of contract after Jensen evolved into something better than Ranger. The fact that Jensen himself was thrilled apparently didn't matter. Velik didn't care about the politics. But with Torwin gone, he had no one shielding him from the worst the guild had to offer, namely, Instructor Peveril and his favorite lackey, Millie. And now, after passing every combat test with ease and saving lives during a field exam, he'd been failed. Not for his performance, but for stepping on the wrong toes. If they won't play fair, then I won't play by their rules. The guild needed Velik more than he needed them. At level 40 and barely 18, with a rare racial subtype, a unique class, and the strength to kill monsters 10 levels above him, he was a walking advertisement for recruitment. The upper ranks will want to keep him, so he was going to make damn sure they heard what Pever was doing. Velik crossed the polished floor of the lobby, doing his best to keep the scowl off his face. It wasn't the desk attendant's fault he was in a foul mood. Not directly, anyway. But the man still flinched a little as Velik approached. "What can I help you with?" the clerk asked, eyes flicking once to the iron pin clipped to Velik's collar. "I need to speak with the guildmaster." The man's polite expression didn't waver. "I'm afraid the guildmaster doesn't take walk-ins. You'll need an appointment." Unspoken, but clear, and irons don't get those. Velik sighed. This is the kind of garbage Torwin was supposed to handle, not chase down goats in some mountain village for punishment duty. "Then pass along a message," Velik said. "Let him decide if it's worth his time." He had only met the guildmaster once, but the man had made it clear. Velik was a valuable asset. He wanted to know what was happening. "I can take a message," the attendant said smoothly, pointedly omitting deliver. Velik's eyes narrowed slightly. Apex Hunter flared in the back of his mind, feeding him tiny cues. The man's practiced calm, the slight dismissiveness, the bored expectation that this conversation would end like all the others. Velik saw it in the set of his shoulders, the tiny tilt of the chin. He leaned forward, voice low and sharp. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. If the guild master truly wants to keep what he called a valuable guild asset in his ranks, he'll make 5 minutes. Go tell him right now. The clerk stiffened. "I don't appreciate threats." "Not a threat," Velik said. "A warning. If you won't pass it along, I'll go myself." That drew a laugh. "Feel free," the man said with a smirk. It's always a good show when some puffed-up iron thinks the rules don't apply to him. Velik turned without a word and walked past him, heading for the stairs that led to the guildmaster's office. Traps lined the path, subtle enchantments and barrier fields meant to discourage exactly this kind of behavior. They weren't lethal, just persuasive. He reached the first barrier, a wall of invisible force that shimmered faintly when touched. Velik pressed his palm to it and pushed. The air cracked like a whip as the barrier buckled. Then with a sharp snap, it shattered in two. The desk attendant's grin vanished. Wait. Do you have any idea how expensive those are to reset?" Velik didn't even look back. "You're welcome to walk ahead and deactivate them." "I'll take your message up," the man said quickly, rushing toward the stairs. "Please just wait here." Velik paused, foot on the first step. "No thanks," he said, and started climbing.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Now panicking at the lack of cooperation Velik was displaying, the attendant rushed ahead of him to disarm the defenses on the stairway, something Velik was absolutely sure the man wasn't supposed to be doing. What if I'd been some sort of shape-shifting monster or a body snatcher? You know those exist, right? He thought as he watched the attendant scamper off. Well, whatever. If you hadn't been such a jackass about it to begin with and just delivered the message like I'd asked, you wouldn't be in this situation. I could have waited an hour or two if needed. Velik took his time, following the attendant up the stairs. Unlike a gold-ranked hunter, the attendant had a special badge that allowed him to pass through unfettered while requiring he still manually deactivate defenses for anyone he was escorting. Velik wasn't sure what the logic behind that was, but he didn't make the rules and didn't much care as long as he made his way to the guildmaster's door. 30 seconds later, he was in the administrative wing of the guild hall. It looked pretty much exactly like Velik remembered, which was to say it was stuffed full of boring offices and boring paperwork. Men and women who lacked the hard, clean, muscular physique of seasoned hunters' staff desks pushed up against walls to take advantage of the sunlight streaming in from the windows. There was a steady stream of traffic coming in and out of various rooms, as well as stairwells that led deeper into the guild hall and weren't available to non-staff members. At the end of the somewhat daunting bastion of paperwork and bureaucracy was Velik's goal, a door made of thick oak, delicate lines of filigree carved around its edges, and an intricately decorated brass handle situated on the left side. A small, rectangular plaque on the door read, Bertram Nelspur, Guild Master. The attendant marched up to it, paused for a second to steel himself, then knocked on the door. "What?" A grumpy voice called out from behind it. "Sir, there's an iron." The attendant paused for a moment and glanced back at Velik, who just stood there with his arms crossed and waited. "An iron-ranked hunter who says he needs to talk to you." "The hell do I care about that?" the guild master yelled back. "I'm busy." He broke through the kinetic wall at the base of the stairs by pushing on it. There was a pause, followed by some muffled swearing and an annoyed groan. Then heavy footsteps stomped toward the door, which was jerked open so fast Velik barely even parsed its movement. He didn't need Apex Hunter to tell him the guild master was strong. That speed sold the story well enough on its own. "You," Nelspur said, looking over the attendant's head to stare at Velik. "You know we have protocol for a reason, right? And if it was being followed properly, we wouldn't need to have a conversation about it," Velik shot back. "As it so happens, I'm having a hard time getting things done fairly and quickly, and I'd like to address that issue." "God tell me, what did those idiots do now?" Nelspur muttered. He gave the attendant a withering look and snapped, "Get back to your post." Then, ungraciously, he gestured Velik into his office and slammed the door behind him. Nelspur was a big man, and high level, too, and Velik strongly disliked turning his back to someone with such a volatile temper, especially when he wasn't at all certain he could beat the man in a fight, but he walked with as much confidence as he could muster and dropped into a plush chair in front of the guildmaster's desk. The office itself was fairly large, but stuffed full of so much furniture that there was barely any room to move around. The desk was huge, bigger than any bed Velik had ever seen in his life. Bookshelves lined 3 walls, all of them more than a foot thick and bursting with leather-bound ledgers. There was a couch pressed up against the remaining wall, right next to the door. It was covered in stains, looked well-worn, and, to Velik's delicate nose, had a distinct smell. Nelspur threw himself into his chair, almost sullenly, and stared at Velik. "Well, what do you want?" "It's about Peveril," Velik started, only to pause when the guild master groaned. "That asshole? What did he do now?" "Well, he failed me on the iron assessment, for starters." "What? That's it?" Nelspur laughed. "And what? You thought you'd come whine to the guild master about it. Did you think I'd overturn the decision? God's kid, you really don't know shit about guild politics, do you?" "I performed my job perfectly," Velik said tightly. "If anyone should have failed on my team, it should have been the girl who decided to charge a split-tailed wolf in the ass and the team leader who should have known better but instead ran in with her. But, of course, my team leader is Peveril's daughter, so she passed with a perfect grade and I got fail because the idiot who had no business being there in the first place got herself hurt." Nelspur's incredulous laugh died out, only to be replaced with a grimace as Velik explained what had happened. It didn't take very long to relate the events of the trial back to him, or to point out a few other instances of catching hell from the head instructor for things that really weren't Velik's fault. A few minutes later, Nelspur said, "So, I guess those etiquette lessons to teach you how to not piss off every single person you meet were a waste of money, huh?" "I'll admit I only attended 2 lessons," Velik said. "They were conflicting with my economics and finances time slots, and I judged managing my money to be far more important." "Debatable," Nelspur muttered. "Look, like I said, guild politics are a thing. There are factions inside the guild that have different objectives, and Peveril's petty enough to spend political capital on this. He gets final say on those trials, and nobody gets to overrule him. If I try, I end up embroiled in a battle for control of the guild while his block does its best to cripple my ability to do my job. I'm not interested in being a victim to your politics," Velik said. "I came here for one reason only. I don't need a shiny pin that says I'm good at killing monsters. I already know I am. I need the information from your specialists and your archives. You get that from me, and I'll be happy to disappear and save you the headache. Giving you access to resources above your ranking is an even tougher sell than getting around Peveril's decision to fail you. That would piss off both his faction and the Ledgermans." "Then what's your solution?" Velik asked. The guild master just stared past him for a minute, his weary face creased with wrinkles and covered in 2-day stubble. Abruptly, he stood up from his desk, reached over to the nearest shelf, and pulled free one of the books. The cover was stained with what Velik hoped was water, but which he suspected was spilled wine based on the color, and the leather was starting to split and crack on the spine. Heedless of any need to handle the fragile book with care, Nelspur flipped it open and started thumbing through the pages. The trials are about teamwork, he explained as he skimmed, because all bronze ranks work in teams. They have to. It's too dangerous otherwise. Even silvers need special dispensation to run solo jobs, and we only let them do it on bronze grade work. You have to get to gold before you're trusted to work on your own. Honestly, even that isn't because everything is magically easier at gold rank. It's just because there are so few of us that we couldn't begin to cover all the work if we made golds group up into teams for every single job that comes our way. We just trust them to know when they're in over their head and retreat to get help. Fascinating, Velik said flatly. There are trials to advance from one rank to the next. When you sign on with the guild, I expected you to complete the basic training an iron goes through, the things you need to know just to function within the guild, and then immediately ascend through the ranks up to gold by knocking out the silver and gold challenges. You said there were no exceptions. Everyone has to go through iron rank training. Technically, you did that, but I didn't pass, Velik protested. That's the whole reason I'm here. Nelspur waved away the objection. I'm assuming you passed everything up to the final trial, all the classes and exercises and lessons. Barely, no thanks to my team leader. Of course. Then if you can pass the gold challenge, that proves you're capable of operating solo. You won't be able to work in a team, but what do you care? You're not here for bronze or silver jobs anyway. So what? I did all the iron coursework and I just go do the gold challenge, then I'm officially gold ranked? Just like that. Well, Nesper hedged. Not exactly like that, but you're not the first person to join the guild with an advanced level. There's precedent for promising initiates skipping steps once they complete the iron trial. You did the stuff I needed you to do. I think I can finagle things to sidestep Peveril's authority if you can prove your competency in a solo trial. That was exactly what Velik wanted to hear. He leaned forward with a grin. What do you need me to do? Is this really the trial you put golds through? Velik asked. Every single one of them, Nelspur told him. And how often does someone just come in and pass this without working their way up through the guild? Not that often, the guild master admitted. Do I get to pick which one I take? Nope. That'll be up to the evaluator. Fantastic. Knowing my luck, I'll get the hardest, most time-consuming option. The trial itself was simple. He'd be given a gold-ranked assignment from the job postings, and an instructor would follow along to evaluate him while he completed it solo. He wouldn't be told what criteria he was being judged on, and the instructor wouldn't interfere except to save a bystander's life, though if they deemed that person being in danger Velik's fault, that would count harshly against him. In theory, it was simple, except that even though gold-ranked monster hunters were allowed to work solo, it wasn't automatically expected of them. Of course, that was part of the test, too. If the job was too much for him to handle, he was supposed to be able to figure that out before he got himself killed, so he could retreat. The problem was that if the instructor didn't agree that a gold-ranked shouldn't be able to complete the job without assistance, it didn't matter whether he could. It would just prove he wasn't ready for gold. The plan was to hope he got an instructor who wasn't friendly with Peveril, get an assignment from the job postings that, with any luck, wouldn't take months to complete, and do his best out there. There were too many variables out of his control to be happy about any of this, but the guild wasn't giving him a lot of other options. When will I know what I'm doing? He asked. Nelspur considered the question for a moment, then said, Give me 3 days to get things set up. I'll need to find your evaluator first, preferably one who isn't part of Peveril's block. There are also 2 jobs on the board I don't want you touching, so I'll see if I can get some other golds to claim those. That way they'll be eliminated from a pool. Velik wanted to say something about how little control the guild master seemed to have over his own guild, but considering the man was doing him a favor in a roundabout sort of way, he figured it was better to keep his mouth shut. Criticisms, no matter how valid they might be, wouldn't help his position. I'd prefer something quick if you can make that happen. I've already lost enough time playing around with the irons. Nelspur raised an eyebrow and stared at him. Awful demanding, aren't you? Whoops. No matter what I say, it's always the wrong thing. Sorry. It's just that this is important to me on a personal level, and... The guild master brushed Velik's attempts at explaining aside. I'm aware of your connection, and believe me, just because you don't have access to the guild vaults yet doesn't mean I don't have people working on it. Trust me, this isn't lost time, and once you get your clearance, we'll have plenty to catch you up on. He hadn't realized there were people already working on his project for him. Then again, he supposed it wasn't really to help him specifically. It was because Torwin had let them know about a major threat. They discover a monster that could impersonate someone and spread seeds to new hosts, who would then eat their victims from the inside out and take over the bodies. The monsters even managed to keep the memories and mannerisms of the people they pretended to be, making them a major threat. Even though they'd killed hundreds of corrupted humans and destroyed thousands upon thousands of the seed clusters and killed the flesh crafter who'd originally created them, the danger was out there. If even one corrupted human had survived the purge and could produce more seeds, there was every chance that a new infection could spread through a city. It might already be happening. So, it made sense to Velik that they weren't waiting for him to graduate monster hunter training to get started, but he doubted they were focused on the same area he was. It wasn't that he thought finding seed bearers was a waste of time. It was just that the guild's focus was on finding the threat and containing it, while Velik wanted to find the person responsible for creating the flesh crafter in the first place. Chalin had been the first victim. They'd found a dungeon seed together as kids, and while Velik had inherited the Dungeon Guardians class and had a racial subtype added to his status, Chalin had become a living dungeon core. Perhaps he'd had control of it at one point, but as he'd killed and added more and more flesh to his body, he'd eventually grown into an entire dungeon. That, combined with the dozen or so people whose minds had been absorbed into the amalgamation, had driven him completely insane. Someone had put that dungeon seed there, had left it to be found. Velik wanted to know who, and he wanted to very, very pointedly express his opinion about that decision to the person responsible. While he was sure that Gestel's government probably wanted to know who'd nearly started a body-snatching plague, the guild's primary concern was handling the fallout from the situation, which meant searching for monsters in disguise and making sure they couldn't build up their numbers again. All right, if that's all the questions, then get out of my office. Find something to keep you busy for a few days, maybe another etiquette lesson or two, and I'll have someone let you know when the details have been decided. At Nelsper's dismissal, Velik stood up and gave the guild master a nod. Thank you for taking the time to deal with this. I'm sure you have 100 other things demanding your attention right now. I do, Nelsper said with a sigh. But this kind of shit shouldn't be happening. I took over the guild specifically to stop people like Peveril from pulling this. 10 years, and I haven't made any headway. Politics. You're the guild master. Get rid of the people causing problems. Gods above. If only it were that easy. Believe me when I say managing just one branch of an organization this size isn't easy, and that even if I controlled the entire Monster Hunters Guild, I'd still have to answer to the king and his ministers. We're essentially a standing army in the middle of his country, one that doesn't owe allegiance directly to a member of the aristocracy. We have to stay on the government's good side if we're going to continue to exist. Things were a lot simpler when I was just a man in the woods with a spear and some monsters to kill. I wouldn't take this guy's job for anything in the world. Something must have shown on his face, because Nelsper abruptly started laughing. I know, it's a nightmare, but someone has to do it. If I resign, well, let's just say I don't think I'd care for the direction the guild would turn if I wasn't in charge. When I do retire, I'll almost certainly sever ties completely, so I don't have to watch how things turn out. Now enough. Begone from my office, you uninvited pest. Shoo! Laughing, Velik left the guild master to his work. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Peveril swaggered into Nelsper's office 2 hours later. The smug little prick didn't even bother to knock before he walked in and flopped into the very same chair Velik had occupied that afternoon. How was your visit? He asked mockingly. You were right, Nelsper said, almost begrudgingly. He hated when Peveril was right, and he almost always was. He has no allegiance to the guild. He just wants access to the resources. Of course I was right. The boy didn't make any secret of it. And besides, it's not like that's a bad thing. Most hunters are with the guild because we make it convenient for them. They can find work, learn how to deal with the monsters they have to hunt, and fence whatever they bring back, all in one convenient place. It's no sin that he wants to take advantage of the guild, too. And yet you cared enough to block his advancement from iron to bronze, Nelsper pointed out. Did Millie put that girl up to charging a split-tail bull's ass? Your idea, I assume. Let's just say I was satisfied with everyone else's performance. Peveril practically purred. Smugness radiated off him in waves, and Nelsper wanted nothing so much as to punch the man in the face. That was a temptation he wrestled with every time the head instructor walked into his office, though. One he was well familiar with and far too disciplined to give in to. You could have just asked him to take the job, Nelsper said. Nonsense. It's far too difficult for a bronze, and that's what he would have been if I'd passed him today. We could never justify it. I don't see what difference it makes in the grand scheme of things, the guildmaster argued. I know you want that job off the books, but we're still going to have to send an evaluator with him to make sure he does it right. This doesn't actually save us any manpower. Ah, true, but you see, any gold can refuse a job if they don't want to. So can an evaluator, Nelsper said with a frown. Unless they... so it's really about her. Peveril just leaned back in his chair. Somehow, his smirk was even wider. And your block is prepared to support my proposal for which vault we'll be targeting? Nelsper asked. Of course. Anything for our esteemed guildmaster. We trust in your vision and follow you to glory. Gods, I hate this prick. Fucking politics. I'll let the boy and his evaluator know where they're heading, Nelsper said sourly. Velik skipped the celebrations that night. Dozens of new bronze-ranked monster hunters gathered at a few of the more popular taverns and common rooms of various inns near the guild hall, including the one he was staying at. He hadn't realized exactly what sort of place Melon and Peach was when he'd first taken a room there, and by the time he'd figured it out, he was already comfortable. The place catered to a relatively wealthy merchant class of patrons, which meant it was clean, well-furnished, and, above all, discreet. Inadvertently, he'd found that last attribute to be the most valuable. Velik was not good at handling people, a fact he considered perfectly reasonable in light of having spent the majority of his life living alone in the woods and rarely talking to another human being. Other people were not so forgiving of that character flaw, regardless of whether they understood why his social skills were so atrophied. So having a place to sleep that was clean and quiet was a godsend. Nobody bothered him. And if he heard people screwing more often than he'd like, well, overhearing things he'd rather not was nothing new. With as many sensory skills as he had and his high mental stat, he'd long since grown desensitized to the sounds of the world around him. Though there was that one girl who made a high-pitched whining sound whenever she was entertaining a guest who'd gotten particularly vigorous. That set his teeth on edge every single time. He considered finding new lodging just about every single time he'd had to endure that particular noise. Fortunately, she was far less active than some of the other girls working at Melon and Peach. Except for tonight, of course. That has to be the fourth time this evening she's taken a client back to her room, he thought sourly. It seemed that more than a few of his fellow irons, or former irons, as the case might be, had decided to splurge in light of their promotions. After his ungracious handling by the guild's higher-ups, listening to other people who didn't have to deal with such blatant discrimination celebrate their victories wasn't his idea of a good time. Nor did Velik want to cross the inn's common areas and risk being seen by anyone he knew. So, he did the sensible thing and went out his third-story window. He closed it behind him, but didn't bother to latch it. It wasn't worth the effort, and there was nothing to steal in there that he actually owned. The sun was just going down when his boots hit the street, filling him with the enhanced strength, speed, and coordination he'd grown accustomed to enjoying when Duskbound activated. Going out in full gear like he was wearing was somewhat frowned upon in the city, but that was more of a societal obligation, not an actual law. He might get hassled by some guards if any saw him, but the iron pin on his collar would keep him out of trouble. A bronze one would have worked better, though, he thought, somewhat bitterly. Screw it. No point in thinking about that tonight, and if the guild master scheme works, I'll have a gold pin soon enough. Velik had been in Cravel for close to 4 months now, and while he'd spent most of his time either in training as an iron of the Monster Hunters Guild or attending private lessons that attempted to patch up his shoddy understanding of the intricacies of polite society, he found one activity that he thoroughly enjoyed. It helped him relax, built a bit of notoriety, and, not that he needed it, lined his purse with silver vitrines. Humming quietly to himself as he navigated the twisted streets of Cravel, he eventually broke free of the merchant quarter and found himself striding down the broad, tree-lined avenues of Gold Town, the district favored by those with money to spare. The people here wore richly dyed clothes and carried themselves with an air of smug superiority, like they knew they were better than the filthy commoners who infested their city. Velik ignored them in much the same way they pretended not to see him, though in his case, it was because he absolutely didn't care in the slightest what they thought about him. Compared to the townsfolk back home who wanted him to die, the disdain of some rich twits he'd never even met wasn't worth even thinking about. The only reason he was even in Gold Town was the Colosseum. It was illegal to transport monsters into the city, of course. That was why the guild did its field tests beyond the walls. That didn't stop rich people from wanting to take in the spectacle of high-level warriors and hunters showing off their classes by slaughtering whatever suitably impressive-looking monsters happened to have been captured in the last week or two. There was something to be said for the allure of a screaming crowd, especially since his gladiatorial persona had quickly proven to be a fan favorite. He wasn't so stupid as to appear as himself, but there were plenty of discreet entrances into the Colosseum, and he had no real difficulty getting in as though he was merely a spectator there to catch a show, then ducking into one of the off-limit areas and making his way to the locker rooms. The staff knew him by sight, if not by name, and they were well paid to keep that knowledge to themselves. Velik had never been accosted outside the Colosseum, and he doubted that would change today. He was here at least 3 times a week, and that put him solidly near the top of the leaderboards, which meant he was well paid for his work. It also meant that the manager liked to save the toughest monsters for Velik. "Gray," one of the bouncers said by way of greeting. He'd adopted the moniker as a simple convenience. Gladiators had a base layer of gray clothes, and those that chose it a mask made of the same material. Most of them put armor on top of that underlayer, either custom crafted or provided by the Colosseum. Velik did not, and had become known as the Gray Gladiator to the fans. "Got anything good tonight?" Velik asked. The bouncer grinned. "Boss said he wanted to talk to you if you came in. No promises, but he seemed excited to me." Velik's lips curled up. "Perfect. He in his office? Last I saw. I'm going to go get changed first, then I'll find him." "Hey," the bouncer said in a low voice as Velik went to walk past. "Think you could drop your first kill of the night in one hit again? I got a bit of a wager with the guys. Wouldn't mind cutting you in on my winnings." "Depend what I'm fighting," Velik said. "I'll see what I can do." The Colosseum's locker rooms were high quality, with fancifully carved wooden benches and stalls that had some sort of magic designed to make waterfall like rain from the ceiling. Velik had seen manual versions of such devices before, usually in the form of a steel tub with some holes drilled through it that had to be filled by the bucket, but the Colosseum was too rich for something simple like that. Even the lockers were made of something better than steel, or maybe just magical polished steel. Velik had covertly tested the material when he'd first become a gladiator, wanting to know that his possessions would be safe from theft. He could probably break a door if he was fully kitted out and gave it his all, but he doubted there were many people in the city who could bring that amount of force to bear. His grays were hanging in his locker, just like he'd left them, and he quickly swapped outfits. Things seemed to grow duller to his eyes, and his limbs felt heavier as the extra stats his gear granted him drained away. That was fine, though. He'd been fighting his whole life without those bonuses. Getting too used to them might get him in trouble in the future, which was another reason he came to the Colosseum to keep his skills sharp. The iron pin that denoted him as a member of the Monster Hunters Guild sat in his coin purse, which was stuffed inside his cloak, and the whole thing was deposited into the locker. Once closed, it only opened again at his touch, though he suspected there were some people on the staff who could bypass those magical locks. Otherwise, he had no idea how they'd clean out the lockers of gladiators who died in the ring. No one had ever tried to tamper with his possessions, however, so Velik was provisionally willing to trust the lockers as long as he never found evidence that changed his mind. He was just paranoid enough that he always made sure to arrange everything in a specific way to make it easier to detect anyone rifling through his possessions. Once he was done switching outfits to his gladiator persona, he exited the locker room and made his way to the manager's office. The door was open, and the pit boss was sitting there, counting out stacks of payment notes and scribbling furiously in a ledger. He got to the bottom of the column, stared at the paper for a second, and started swearing under his breath. "Ned, you wanted to talk to me," Velik said from the open doorway. The man jerked in place, then glanced up. "Gray, good timing. Yeah, I got something in holding I think you'll have fun with, but it was expensive to acquire, so I need you to promise not to just blow it to pieces like you did with that bog drake a few weeks ago. You have to put on a good show, or else it'll go to Glitter Ring. I doubt I could ever put on a show to match anything Glitter Ring does." Ned shrugged. "Sure, but you've got a bloodthirstiness to you. Your fights are visceral and raw. The crowd loves it with the blood, so I think this is the perfect monster for you." "Why? What's so special about it?" Velik asked. The pit boss just grinned at him. "Let's not ruin the fun. So, you interested?" "Perfect. Just what I was looking for tonight." Velik honestly wasn't sure how the Colosseum smuggled monsters into the city, but he imagined it probably involved paying some corrupt official to look the other way. He was sure they had at least one beast tamer on their roster, probably more, and with a focus on pacifying monsters for transit, then riling them up for their turn in the arena. As far as he was aware, the class was only minimally effective against monsters, but it was better than nothing. Whoever it was that was in charge of the menagerie, as they called it, their existence was a well-kept secret. None of the guards knew who handled the monsters, or if they did, they were all paid well enough to lie about it. It was a mystery he'd considered investigating more than once. But at the end of the day, he valued having a convenient place to fight more than he did whatever dubious benefits he might glean from prying into the Colosseum's operation. His first fight of the night was nothing special. It was a big, dumb, weak thing with a hard, chitinous exoskeleton and quick, jerky movements that looked like some sort of hybrid between a lizard and a bug. Even armed as he was with nothing but a painted steel pole that had been filed to a tapered point, he killed it in one strike. Its chitin crunched as the crude spear punctured its head, driving it to the floor and pinning it there while its 6 limbs spasmed and scraped across the stone. "If you blinked, you missed it," the commentator screamed, his voice amplified by magic. But we all knew it was going to be a quick one with Gray in the arena. Let's just hope he's got something tougher to fight next time. Velik retreated back into the hallways beneath the stands and returned to the gladiators' lobby, where 3 other men and 2 women were waiting for their turns. Most fights lasted 5 to 10 minutes, usually because the gladiator was deliberately dragging it out for the spectacle. Velik's rarely lasted more than 3, and even then, only if they put him up against something bulky and armored enough that he broke his weapon on it. From the dirty looks he got from a few of the bouncers when they thought he wouldn't notice while he was walking back, he supposed quite a bit of money had changed hands. For that matter, 2 of the gladiators were hiding scowls as well. Gambling went hand in hand with Colosseum culture. That was half the point of even showing up there, and the staff wasn't immune. Velik wasn't here to make friends, and he wasn't here to win or lose money. He just wanted to kill monsters without having to run 100 miles to find something that probably wouldn't even be a challenge. The fight fees barely translated to a few dekarmos, and it was all in coinage, which made it a pain to carry around. He went through 3 more fights, none of them challenging in the way he was looking for, before it was time for the night's main event. One of the coordinators came to fetch him from the lobby around his 3rd hour at the Colosseum and escorted him to the arena. "Boss wanted me to remind you that if you kill this thing in one shot, not only will you not get paid, but he'll ban you from fighting here ever again," the coordinator said. This thing was expensive as all hell to import, and he wanted a fight that lasts at least 10 minutes. Fake an injury if you have to, or hell, get hurt for real. "We got a healer on site you could finally meet." "I'll keep that in mind," Velik said, having absolutely no intention of letting some monster touch him. Ned had refused to tell him what the monster was, the better to make the fight. Velik doubted it would change much, but he wasn't immune to being surprised. Truthfully, Ned underestimated him. Apex Hunter gave him a good feel of the relative strength of the other gladiators, and there wasn't another one over level 30, let alone 40, on the roster. Even then, the only one who had anything better than an uncommon class was Glitter Ring, and she was more of a showman than a fighter. Most of her matches involved her dancing around, shooting off scintillating lights that left the monster dazed and unable to keep track of her. "And here it is," the commentator yelled as Velik entered the arena. The gate closed behind him with a heavy clang, more to keep the monster from fleeing than to stop him from leaving. Gray's back for the main event of the night, and we got a big one. The Golden Coliseum's never seen a fight like this. Anybody missing this night's show is sure to regret it. The portcullis on the far side of the arena was hauled up by a pair of handlers positioned on top of the wall, causing Velik to raise an eyebrow in surprise. That was not the typical level of caution they displayed when releasing a monster. Whatever he was fighting was something exotic or dangerous or both. The monster crawled out of its cage, the steel creaking under its weight as it moved, and crossed to the stone floor. It was big, taller than the bull he'd killed earlier, and covered in pinkish-red flesh, like a man with a bad sunburn. It had 6 legs, though they looked more like arms and didn't all bend the same way. Where its head should have been was an overly large ball of flesh with no features other than a mouth. Velik's breath caught in his throat. It can't be. That's right. It's a Slokerin flesh beast all the way from the mountains. I hope Gray is prepared for a long, grueling fight. We all know these don't go down easy. How is this here? I killed all these. His eyes narrowed. From Slokera, he said. That means this is a lead. There was another dungeon seed there, gripping the pole. He refused to think of such a crude weapon as an actual spear. Velik strode forward to meet the flesh beast's lumbering charge. As awkward and ungainly as it was running on 6 arm legs that didn't coordinate, it nonetheless had plenty of size and speed. He pivoted smoothly as it charged by and dragged the sharp end of the pole across its flank. One of the hands snaked up to grab at his leg, but he hopped over the limbs smoothly and let savage rhythm pull him into a retaliatory strike. Then the flesh beast was past him and scrambling against the smooth stone to turn itself around. Velik took the opportunity to jab the pole into its backside 3 more times while the commentator relayed the initial exchange to the crowd. They were screaming so loud that it was a wonder the soundproofing enchantments on the building were holding. Ned wanted a long fight, but he'd have to settle for a bloody one. The flesh beast wasn't nearly strong enough to challenge Velik, and he knew he'd quickly put so many holes in it that it'd stop moving. Even if he dragged it out a bit, not much would change. Wait, where'd that cut on its side go? Is this thing regenerating? Sure enough, the initial wounds he'd dealt it were already closing up, and in record time, too. Velik looked down at his pole in disbelief, suddenly unsure if the weapon would be enough to finish an opponent like this. On the other hand, he wanted to work off some anger, and it wasn't like the last few fights had done much. When the flesh beast, easily twice his height, loomed over him again, he grinned behind his mask. Grasping hands reached for his face as it rose up on its back 2 legs and slammed its weight down hard enough to crack the floor. But Velik was already gone. He leaped on top of the flesh beast and perforated its back, digging the pole deep under its skin and shredding muscle. The monster roared, more in anger than pain, and bucked wildly in an attempt to throw him off. Much to the crowd's amusement, Velik easily kept his balance while stabbing the pole repeatedly into the monster. Undaunted, 2 of the flesh beast's arms cracked and tore as they pulled from their joints and reoriented in a new direction. Moments later, they were now facing upwards instead of down and were lunging blindly at Velik. He faded backwards a single step to dodge their initial swipes, jabbed the pole into the closer arm twice, and jumped clear before the monster could react. Annoyingly, the wounds were closing almost as fast as he could make them. This is a lot less enjoyable when it feels like I'm getting nowhere. I bet if I was using my real spear, the bleeding enchantment on it would help counteract that regeneration. He led the flesh beast around the arena for the next few minutes while he experimented. Organ damage slowed it down the most, but it seemed capable of regenerating even from that. Severing tendons and ligaments was difficult with a sharpened pole, but he managed to tear a few by means of stabbing the pole in, then ripping it free with brute strength. That kind of injury healed up too quickly to be worth the risk, especially when the monster had 5 other legs it could move around on. Looks like we finally found a monster that's giving even Gray some trouble, the commentator yelled to the ground. What will he do? Are we finally going to see him use an active skill, or two? Now that's an idea, but if it doesn't work, I probably won't have a weapon left. He just have to make the shot count. 20 feet of empty arena separated him from the flesh beast, and that distance was already shrinking as it galloped his way. A bellow shook the floor right along with its pounding footsteps, but Velik ignored all that and readied his weapon. What's this? The commentator called, excitement racing through his words. Looks like Gray's trying something new, but will it be enough to stop the inexhaustible beast, or will he be smeared across the arena floor? Dreadlance arced down the pole, filling his vision with crackling light as energy erupted through the point of the spear and into the flesh beast's bulbous meatball head. When the light faded, Velik was standing there with empty hands and an empty arena. By crockies, did you see that? The commentator screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the audience's cheers. Where'd you get it? Velik asked Ned. You know I can't tell you that. It's a trade secret. Here are your winnings. Fuck the gold. Velik snarled. He smacked the bag hard enough to send it flying into the wall and leaned over the desk. That monster, where did it come from? I don't care who sold it to you. I want to know where it was found. Ned's eyes were wide as he looked down at the split leather bag with gold coins spilling out the seam. The bouncer outside the office poked his head in, but Ned sent him away with a small shake of his head. Look, Gray, I'm sorry, but save it, Velik told him. This is important to me. I'm not leaving without an answer. He was still in his gladiator's clothes, which were covered in blood with small chunks of skin glued to the fabric. The pole he'd been armed with was gone, but it wasn't like he actually needed it to push around a guy half his level with a weak administrator class. And Velik wasn't feeling charitable. Being confronted by a flesh beast had set his nerves on edge and dragged bad memories to the surface. He could still feel the give in the flesh-covered ground of the cave he'd last fought those monsters in, could still smell the putrid stink of the dungeon as it rotted before his eyes after he'd destroyed the core. The image of Kalen's twisted body, what was left of it at least, was etched into his brain. All right, Ned said, his voice shaky. Just the location it was picked up from? No names. No smuggling routes? You just want to go out and hunt some in the wild, or whatever. Sure, let's go with that. I'm going on a hunting trip, and I enjoyed my fight tonight so much that I want to do it again. Ned pulled a thick portfolio out of his desk and set it down in front of him. Flipping it open, he started rifling through what appeared to be a highly disorganized mess, with all sorts of random scraps in there. There were small squares of paper with random notes scribbled across them, what looked like invoices for goods and repairs on equipment, a lewd charcoal sketch that Ned hastily flipped past, and finally, about halfway down the stack, a report that hopefully contained the information Velik wanted. The Verdant Belt, Ned announced. South End, near the ancestral hunting grounds of the Cormac tribe. They would probably be able to direct you more appropriately once you arrived. The bill of sale doesn't mention, but the transport team probably picked the monster up straight out of one of their camps. Verdant Belt, Velik repeated. His geography lessons hadn't really progressed to the point where he'd started learning the regions of other countries, but he could read a map and he wasn't afraid to ask for directions. He'd find it, one way or another. If he had the distance right, he was looking at perhaps 2 weeks of hard travel with few stops for rest, more if the roads ran out before he reached his destination. There would be a border crossing he'd need to deal with somehow too. The easiest way would probably be to just not cross over there. It wasn't like wilderness travel scared him, and he didn't much care if he was there illegally. The odds of a group of people calling themselves a tribe wanting to check his paperwork seemed low. Thank you, he said, and I'm sorry. This. He trailed off and shook his head. With a sigh, he pulled 10 dekarmas from his status screen, the coins materializing one on top of another in a small stack. I'd appreciate if this conversation stayed between us. I don't plan on coming back here again, and I'd hate to have to change my mind. Ned's eyes glittered with greed as he eyed the stack. The dekarmas were worth more than the sack of gold fool mites he'd smacked off the desk, which Velik had also made no move to reclaim. No doubt Ned saw a nice little payday that his bosses didn't need to know about sitting in front of him. Velik left him to it, only taking the time to reclaim his gear from the locker rooms. Once again fully kitted out, he swept out of the Colosseum, ignoring the eager grin from the bouncer who'd bet on him to kill his first monster in a single blow earlier. The man's smile faltered as Velik stalked past. "Wonder what's wrong with him?" the bouncer muttered under his breath, unaware that Velik could still hear him from 100 feet away. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. At first, Jensen hadn't been sure. He didn't really care to watch the fights, but the merchant, Shalir Blinston, he was hoping to talk into helping finance his first expedition, loved the Colosseum. So that was where they had their meeting. For times, the talks had stalled so the man could fawn over one of the gladiators, and Jensen had found himself growing more and more annoyed. Then the one called Gray had walked out. "Oh, he's fighting tonight," Shalir crowed. "You're in for a treat, my young friend." Jensen watched Gray demolish the first two monsters curiously, noting that the fighter wore none of the enchanted armor he'd seen on the other gladiators. Even his weapon was nothing more than a sharpened steel pole. When the flesh beast had been dumped into the arena, he nearly jumped out of his skin. Though he hadn't seen any of the monsters personally, he'd gotten a good description of them, and hearing the announcer name the monster had cemented it. The way Gray had reacted was just further evidence of his suspicions. He put the thought out of his mind and tried to steer his would-be business partner back to the matter at hand, but Shalir would have none of it while Gray fought. Truthfully, Jensen found the fight to be somewhat boring, being nothing more than variations of dodging, stabbing, and dodging some more. It wasn't until Gray had unveiled some incredibly destructive skill at the end that Jensen had really paid attention. Right height, right build, right weapon and set of skills. It has to be you, but what are you doing here? He wondered. You can't be that desperate for money. Torwin said you clean up all those champions and claim the seeds. Now, that was a fight. Gods, did you see how he finished that monster off at the end? I saw, Jensen said. Now, as I was saying, lad, the merchant said, cutting him off. Jensen suppressed a twinge of annoyance. It's not that I don't think you'll find something. Your class alone guarantees that. It's that you've got too much opposition against you. It's bad for business to go against your father's wishes. And there it is. That's why he's been jerking me around all night. My father's one step ahead of me, scaring off all my potential investors to keep me here. There's nothing I could do to change your mind? Jensen asked. Sorry, Shalir said with a shrug. The dangers of not coming back. I'm sure my father has oversold the risk. He's not exactly unbiased when it comes to matters of my safety, Jensen said smoothly. But if that's what you're worried about. Shalir leaned forward. What if we hired Gray onto the caravan? Oh ho, the man laughed. I suppose I'd have to meet him to interview him, as an investor looking to protect my assets. Of course, it's only practical. But no one knows who Gray is, and the Colosseum won't sell out their gladiators, not even to me. Believe me, I've already tried. I think I've got a good idea of how to find him, Jensen told him. Got you. The merchant pretended to consider it, but he'd already made up his mind. Crossing Jensen's father was worth it for the chance to meet his favorite gladiator. He wanted it and was willing to pay the price. It wasn't even about how much money Jensen wanted at this point. All right, lad. Call it a test of competence. If you're so sure, you bring me Gray to interview. As long as I'm satisfied, you'll get your Dekarmos. Give me a day or so to convince him, Jensen said. He's not going to be motivated by a pile of money. Shalir snorted. Everyone's motivated by money. If you think otherwise, you're just not using enough of it. And if you think a gladiator doesn't care about his coin, maybe I should reconsider this deal. He's not fighting for money, Jensen insisted. But you can ask him yourself when I bring him to see you. I'll hold you to that. The merchant warned with a hearty laugh. That's fine by me. Jensen rose from the table. If you'll excuse me, I think I'll just go catch up with him. And just how are you going to do that? It's not like he's going to walk out onto the street wearing his arena grays. Oh, I have my ways. I am a vault seeker, after all. Shalir's eyes widened. You can find people, too? No. Jensen didn't answer out loud, just shot the merchant a wink and left. Velik was a quarter-mile from the Colosseum, still solidly in Gold Town, when he sensed someone following him. Whoever it was, they were making no effort to hide their presence. Footsteps jogged down the street behind him, coming in his direction, and at first, he suspected a member of the City Watch. It was hard to think of anyone else who'd have a reason to chase him down in the middle of a random street in an affluent neighborhood late at night. Then he saw who was running after him. Haven't seen him in a while. Please don't be a fan of the Colosseum. I'm not interested in talking about it. Velik, Jensen said as he approached. Hi. Velik said guardedly. Torwin's former apprentice didn't look much like how Velik remembered him. Gone were the various trinkets, the leather, the gauntlets, and the bow. His hair was combed out and tied back behind his head, and his face didn't have so much as a speck of dirt. Even his nails were trimmed and cleaned. Instead of any sort of armor, he was wearing clothes that Velik didn't have words for, but which were far more common in places like Gold Town than they were in the poor parts of the city. Saw your fight back there, Jensen said. Damn it. What fight? Velik asked, hoping to deflect the conversation, but doubting it would work. The one where you disintegrated that flesh beast. Was it the same as the ones up north? Velik was not a good liar. His best defense against probing questions was to shut his mouth and scowl at whoever was trying to pump him for information. But in this case, Jensen was kind of an ally, and if he'd learned anything from those stupid etiquette classes, which was debatable according to his instructor, it was that burning bridges by being surly and rude had a tendency to come back and cause him problems later. I don't know, he admitted after a heavy pause. It was similar. I think its regeneration might have been stronger, but that might have been a level difference, or because I wasn't using a real weapon to fight it. You're going to follow up on it? Jensen asked. When I can. It's out of the country, and I'm still tangled up in some guild business. If I bail on him now, the last few months of work will have been for nothing, so I want to get that taken care of before I go. Hopefully it'll only take a few days. Knowing his luck, it wouldn't be that quick. Completing a gold-ranked assignment could take a day or two, or it could take months. For that matter, it could be a week or more of traveling one way just to get to wherever the problem was. Bronzes and silvers tended to work at the local level, but there weren't enough golds that they always had that luxury. The only thing he was sure of was that he wouldn't be leaving the country, as the Monster Hunters Guild didn't have a license to operate outside of Gestel. You need help getting out of the country? Jensen asked. It was suspicious and concerning that he'd latched onto that. Velik knew he wasn't politically savvy, but he was smart enough to recognize when someone wanted something from him. I wouldn't say I need help, he said slowly. It's just Slokera. Might be a bit of a pain to get across the border, but I'll manage somehow. Maybe we could help each other. There it is. What do you want, Jensen? Would it kill you to just say it instead of hedging the whole time? Help how? Velik asked. You remember my class upgrade? Well, I'm trying to put together an expedition, but I'm hitting some unexpected snags. Jensen paused for a minute. Maybe not so unexpected. My father doesn't want me doing something so dangerous, so he's leaning on every potential investor I can find. Without some startup capital, I'll never get out of the city. You want me to fund your expedition? Velik asked, surprised. He had a lot of Dekarmos, but that was more on a personal level than a business one. Maybe he could buy out the general store at any of the frontier towns, but he doubted he could afford to finance the kind of project Jensen was talking about. What? You? Gods no. No offense, but I doubt those champion seeds were worth that much. No. You see, I've got a potential investor who just loves the Colosseum. Guess who his favorite gladiator is? Velik groaned. I don't like where this is going. He wants to meet you and gush over how amazing you are. You could probably just wear the gladiator mask and preserve your identity, though I doubt he'd go running to the guild to tell them you've been participating in illegal underground monster fights. And he wants you to hire onto the expedition as muscle to protect his interests. That explains what you get out of it, Velik said. Where's the part where this helps me? Simple. We haven't set a destination yet. We'll just pick some place in Slokera, preferably close to where you need to go. Then you can cross the border with the caravan and not have to worry about things. That would make the checkpoint easier to handle, not to mention giving him some legitimacy for being in the country if the local authorities decided to hassle him. But it also meant traveling on someone else's schedule. Their pace would be much slower than what he could manage on his own, and he had no idea when Jensen's expedition was even leaving. It could be months away, still. I'm going to need some more details before I agree to anything, Velik said. Well, we haven't really set anything in stone yet. Acquiring funding is the first step, and the investors get a say in things, so we have more of an outline of a plan with a lot of decisions yet to be made. But ultimately, I'm the one who decides where the expedition goes. So, if I say Slokera, then we head south. Somehow, Velik doubted it was that simple. If other people were involved and throwing money at the project, they were going to want to say in where it went, how long it stayed, and, irrelevant to Velik, what happened to whatever was discovered and brought back. Maybe in the future, when Jensen had enough cash to fund the whole thing himself, he could make every little decision, but that didn't seem to be the case today. Okay, here's what I'll do. I'll meet with your investor and tell him that I'm willing to sign on, but only so long as the expedition goes to Slokera. I don't know how long I'm going to be out of the city doing this guild stuff, but I prefer to leave as soon as possible once I come back. I'll also expect a week or two to take care of my own business once we get to whatever site your class points you to. That, or I won't be accompanying you back home after you're done. That's mostly fair, Jensen agreed. The departure time thing is a tough sell. If you had a better idea, we could plan around that. Let's say 6 weeks from today as a soft target that we can push back a little bit if we have to. Velik had no idea if he was agreeing to something reasonable here, but he at least knew enough about Jensen to know that he was fundamentally honest and greedy. He would try to get as much money as he could out of the expedition without screwing everyone else over. Whether or not this was a good deal, he at least trusted that Jensen thought it was. I'll agree to meet with your investor, Velik said after he thought about it. We'll figure out terms from there. Excellent. I'll come meet you tomorrow and take you on by. Where are you staying? Melon and Peach. Jensen's grin faltered. The cat house. I didn't realize what it was when I found it. It was clean, quiet, and comfortable. Yeah, I guess. Maybe we can just meet at the guild hall? Let's say around noon. Velik quickly agreed, not in the least because he wanted to get moving again. More than a few passers-by had been giving them curious looks, not all of them friendly. The fact of the matter was that he'd been so distracted back at the Colosseum that he hadn't showered before leaving, and there was still some dried blood on him that his grays hadn't blocked. The two parted ways, Jensen heading deeper into Gold Town and Velik returning to Melon and Peach. Normally, he'd have stayed up for another 4 or 5 hours, but he'd learned early on that with no monsters to kill and a city full of patrolmen who were quite eager to know what exactly he was doing skulking around late at night, it was easier to just adapt his schedule to take care of all of his business while the sun was up. His temporary home, of course, was open all night long. That was how he'd found it in the first place, by looking for a place to sleep an hour before dawn. Melon and Peach was upscale enough that he was able to claim a meal before bed, a luxury he'd promised himself he'd never take for granted. 10 years of eating his own cooking had been more than enough. He took a quick bath, ignoring the women he was sharing the shallow pool with. They were off duty at this point and not interested in flirting, though perhaps it had more to do with his absolute refusal to get dragged into any of their beds the entire time he'd been staying there. They'd learned quickly enough not to waste their time asking. Jensen and this gold-ranked assignment. Slokera and flesh beasts. Everything's coming all at once now after months of boredom. That's just my luck. With those thoughts chasing each other around in his head, he finally closed his eyes and fell asleep. The guild had a postal system it used to communicate between members who weren't regularly in the guild hall at the same time. Everyone had a mailbox, even the irons. Velik was expecting a notice for an appointment to meet with Guild Master Nelsper again to arrive soon. So the first thing he did when he walked into the building the next day was check his box. Or rather, the first thing he did was inquire if there was anything for him. Golds and silvers got actual mail slots that were attuned to them and couldn't be opened by just anybody. Everyone else got a regular old box locked up out of casual reach and had to wait for whoever was manning the desk to go check to see what was in there. He'd have thought a simple lock and key would have been sufficient security, but apparently it wasn't for whatever reason. While he was standing there waiting, someone walked up behind him. At first, Velik assumed it was just another iron or bronze waiting for their turn, but Apex Hunter quickly disabused him of that notion. He was already turning around to face the threat when a voice said, "You're the guy that pissed Peveril off?" She was a head shorter than him, with long, thick, true red hair pulled back into a tail and a splattering of freckles across her nose and cheeks. Hard blue eyes squinted up at him, faint lines in the corners. If he were to guess, he'd put her in her late 30s or early 40s, and probably gold-ranked according to Apex Hunter. She was dressed in full field kit, the same as him, and though he was no expert at judging the value of gear just by looking at it, he was willing to bet she'd spent a good deal of money on it. I suppose I am. He seems temperamental, though. Wouldn't surprise me at all if there's a few of us running around here. The woman barked out a laugh at that. I'm Arya. They dragged me in to be the evaluator for your gold trial. Gotta say, you're a bit young for the rank. Wasn't my idea, Velik said. So I've heard. Frankly, this whole thing stinks of bullshit guild politics, but what are you going to do about it, right? Right? Velik said slowly. Even for his tastes, this woman was a bit brusque. Anyway, finish up whatever you're doing here, so we can go find out what crap job they're pawning off on us, Arya told him. Bortram wants us in his office right now. We're already late. We are. Just at that moment, the mailroom attendant came back with a card in his hand. Velik didn't even need to take it to see an appointment time marked for 20 minutes ago printed on its surface. Damn it. That's not my fault. Arya glanced at the card and snorted. Guild policy says you're supposed to check for your mail first thing in the morning when you're in the city. I just woke up 20 minutes ago. She shrugged. Don't stay out all night in a cat house then. When he shot her a surprised look, she tapped the side of her nose and said, Can't fool this thing. He supposed the perfume was faintly clinging to him, but really, even to his senses, it was barely there. The fact that she could smell it on him was impressive, especially considering one of the skills folded into Apex Hunter was scent tracking. I live there, he explained. You live in Cat House? Well, you're either extremely wasteful with your vast fortune or, I don't know, you just have screwed up priorities? No, I mean I rent a room there like at an inn. Arya's face screwed up at that. Why? Get a girlfriend or something. No, not for, you know what, never mind. Let's just go already. He was supposed to meet Jensen soon, and he wanted this surprise meeting over with before he was late for that appointment. One of the lessons that had stuck with him was that it was rude to make someone wait, even if it was due to an unavoidable delay. How exactly that was rude behavior still eluded Velik. But like most of his etiquette lessons, he focused on memorizing the rules and left worrying about the explanations for why they were the way they were for some other time. He covertly studied the gold rank while he followed her across the guild hall. She had a smooth gait, perfectly balanced and easy. High physical, but maybe not as high as mine. High mental, too. She didn't try to identify me, though. If she's got something, it must be a passive like mine. Her class probably feeds both those stats and ignores mystic, or else her gear skews heavily towards physical and mental. See something you like back there? Arya asked as they climbed the stairs. What? No, that's not. Relax, kid. Morgus's hairy balls, you're easy to get going. Please don't let this be a long assignment. I don't think I can deal with this woman for an extended period of time. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Nelsberg gave them a look that could have peeled paint when they entered his office. You're late, he said. Sorry, Velik said. I just got in and I don't care about your excuses. Just take a seat so I can go over this. Getting real sick of today already. You know how this works, Nelsper said after they'd both claimed a chair. Velik is trying to skip bronze and silver and jump straight to gold. That means he's got to do the same thing every other potential gold-ranked hunter does. Complete a gold assignment solo. Yeah, so which one's it going to be? Tell me we're sending him after those wyverns nesting up in the mountains. There's a town up there with a nice set of hot springs I've been wanting to get back to, Arya said. While we'll be a reptilian monster, it's not the wyverns. Lavarak's team took that one a few days ago, anyway. What other reptilian jobs are left? There were those sandrakes, but I thought that job got pulled last week. Wait. No, absolutely not. What is it? Velik asked. Arya was livid. No fucking way am I doing that shit job, she snarled, rising from her chair and leaning onto the guild master's desk. Part of Velik wanted to laugh at the sight of a woman who didn't even clear 5.5 feet tall, trying to loom over anyone, but the look on Arya's face strangled any appearance of levity. Nelsper waited calmly until she finished speaking, then said, You owe the guild an evaluation as reparations for the incident. You acknowledged and agreed to this when we stepped in and smoothed everything over in Valmath. The evaluator does not get to choose the assignment. Anything else? Arya argued. I don't care how far away it is or how long it takes to do. This was the compromise we all agreed on, Nelspur said. You don't have a choice if you want to retain your rank, Arya. Son of a bitch, she swore, spinning around and giving Velik the evil eye. You'd better be real fucking good at your job, newbie. I want this thing hunted down and dead inside a day when we get there, or I'm failing your ass. You'll do nothing of the sort, Velspur said, his voice cracking like a whip. You will do your job as an evaluator, impartially and professionally. Do I make myself clear? Does anyone feel like telling me what the job actually is? Velik cut in. It's a god's damned hydra, Arya said. A swamp hydra, to be specific. It's been open on the books for months because nobody wants to kill it. Going to be a miserable experience getting out there, a miserable experience hunting the thing down, a miserable experience killing it, and a miserable experience disposing of it so it doesn't come back. Hydras can come back after they die? That wasn't in the bestiary. Arya cast a suspicious glance at the guildmaster, then back at Velik. Finally, she let out a frustrated sigh and said, Get your kit packed up. We're leaving in an hour. I actually have another appointment in a few minutes, Velik said. I was told this was going to take a few days to sort out. Fine, whatever. Take care of that. Be back here in 4 hours. I'm going to pamper myself into a drunken stupor before we leave. It might be the last time I'm truly clean before I die. With that said, Arya stormed out of the office. Velik tried not to wince as the door slammed behind her. Is the job really that bad? He asked Velspur. I'm afraid it's not going to be a pleasant one. I didn't want this to be what you got stuck with, but politics are politics. The silver lining to this whole debacle is that if you can kill this swamp hydra, there's no way anyone can deny your promotion to gold. Arya's mad now, but she knows it's not your fault, and she'll calm down. You'll get a fair evaluation from her. Just follow her instructions and do your job. If half of what Torwin told me is true, this shouldn't be outside your capabilities. Right, Velik said. How far away is this? I have some other things going on that are time-sensitive, and I need a plan around this trip. Let me fill you in on the details before you go, Nelspur said, reaching for a folder on his desk. They'd agreed that Jensen would do the majority of the talking. All Velik had to do was introduce himself, prove he was Gray the top gladiator, and confirm that he was signing on to Jensen's expedition. In theory, his role was a minor one, and he was hoping he'd only be there for a few minutes. Mr. Alderworth, the doorman, said as they approached. He was a big man, close to 6.5 feet tall, and probably the better part of 300 pounds. Surprisingly, he was also a significantly higher level than average. Velik was pegging him at 33 or 34. And guessed. Velik had removed his more distinctive pieces of gear and donned a plain mask in an attempt to preserve some of his anonymity. It was clear the doorman was taken aback by the wardrobe choices, but for whatever reason, he decided not to comment on it. We're expected, Jensen told him. Of course. The house was huge, bigger than anything Velik had seen prior to coming to the city. Made of some sort of cut and sanded stone block and 3 stories high. It had hundreds of windows studding both wings facing the street, though it was separated from foot traffic by a 14-foot-tall fence of wrought iron that curved outward at the top and had barbs curling outward from the bars. The gate guard had let them by on Jensen's word alone, but Velik guessed he'd had some magical way to communicate up to the house, because it was obvious that the doorman had been sent to meet them. He smelled of old leather and perfume, a scent that permeated the whole house. It was so strong that even before the doorman let them inside, he could detect its cloying stink. 2 men and 1 woman were waiting for them inside, all also into the mid-30s. Security. This guy might be a fan, but he's not foolhardy enough to let a powerful person of unknown loyalties into his house without taking a few precautions. Master Blenston is in the training yard out back, the doorman informed them. We'll escort you there. The trip through the Lordling's house took far longer than Velik felt it should have. Who needs all these rooms? What are they even for? You could run laps in the hallways, but they eventually found themselves in a closed-off courtyard. It had a still brown, grassy strip that was slowly coming back to life in the winter months, surrounding a 50-foot square of hard-packed dirt, inside of which several people were sparring with each other, while a portly man watched from the sidelines under the shade of an awning that jutted out from an equipment storage shed. "Sir, Mr. Alderworth has arrived," the doorman announced. "Jensen," the portly man said with a laugh as he bounced to his feet. "And you brought a friend. Is he?" "I told you that I was good at my job," Jensen said. "Splendid. You've convinced him to sign on to this little venture as well." "With some stipulations, but nothing I feel is unworkable," Jensen replied smoothly. "Shall we go over things?" No. Plenty of time for that later. First, I like a proper introduction to this man. Would you prefer to go by Gray, or with something a bit more familiar?" "Gray is fine," Velik said. "Ah, a man of mystery. I can respect that," Blinston clucked, bobbing his head as he spoke. "I hope you wouldn't mind favoring us with a duel against one of my retainers, just to prove your credentials. Your identity being a secret and all, you'll understand why I can't just take young Jensen's word on things." "I can assure you," Jensen started to say, only to cut himself off when Blinston held up a hand. "It's not that I doubt you, but business interests must be properly vetted. And besides, a private show from the Colosseum's best gladiator, a duel no less. Who wouldn't want to see that?" Jensen had mentioned the man was an avid fan of the Colosseum's blood sports, but Velik thought that perhaps he'd undersold Blinston's fervor. The 4 sparring matches were still going on in the background, overseen by a woman who couldn't be an inch over 5 feet in height, who was standing in the middle with her arms crossed and scowling at everyone. She had iron-gray hair pulled back into a tight bun and a multitude of scars covering the left side of her face. Heavy steel armor covered her from her neck down to her feet, interrupted only by a leather belt with an arming sword strapped to her hip. On such a small frame, the sword's tip came down nearly to her ankles. At Blinston's declaration, she shot him a look that clearly said she wasn't impressed with the idea, but instead of arguing, she clapped her hands once and barked out, "Fight's over. Line up." Immediately, the 8 combatants sprang apart. They rushed over to the west side of the square and formed a line, one which their instructor eyed up critically for a moment before nodding to herself. Almost casually, she strolled over to where Blinston stood with Velik and Jensen. Velik watched the whole thing curiously. He hadn't ever had any formal combat training, and by the time he was in a position to access it, it was far too late to need it. Spear Warden was at rank 9 and 4 different skills as components to it. The system had taught him everything he needed to know about handling his weapon, and it was far too late for some sparring practice to help him rank up the skill. "Sir," the woman said as she approached. "Very good, Gillar," Blinston said. He waved a hand at the woman and said, "My captain of the guard and combat instructor for my own personal guards. Gillar, this is the Vault Seeker. I'm considering financing a joint venture with, and presumably his associate, the champion gladiator Gray." "Gray, huh?" Gillar repeated, eyeing him speculatively. Velik felt something brush against him, probably an identify or something similar. He rebuffed the skill, which drew a quirked eyebrow from the woman. "I hear you're real good at killing monsters." "Reasonably," Velik said. "He ought to be, considering he'd been doing it most of his life." "How about people? Hunting humans down isn't really my area of expertise." "A hunter, huh? Oops. Damn it." With no witty rebuttal readily springing to mind, Velik decided his best course of action was to just keep his mouth shut. Gillar looked perversely pleased to have tripped him up, and even Jensen was smirking in the background. "So a duel," Blinston said. "Let's say." What do you think, Gillar?" "Artorian rules." "Fine by me, sir," she said without taking her eyes off Velik. He hadn't expected to be actually fighting someone when he'd agreed to this. He'd figured he'd be throwing out a single dreadlance to serve as his credentials. Then he'd fade into the background, or even better, leave. Jensen was no help, either, just standing there with that stupidly amused look on his face and making no attempts to get Velik out of this. "I'm not familiar," he said. If he was going to be fighting someone, he figured he should at least know what the rules of the game were. 3 hits to victory. No headshots. No crippling blows. No activated skills or enchanted gear. No potions or support spells from others. Training weapons only, Gillar rattled off. That took Dreadlance off the table, but Velik didn't want to kill the woman, so he wouldn't have used it anyway. Beast of Burden, his newest skill, wouldn't work on her anyway, leaving him with Apex Hunter, Spear Warden, and Savage Rhythm. It still felt like an unfair advantage, but there was no telling what skills Gillar had. She was near the same level as him, as best he could tell, which put her 20 levels over the trainees who'd been sparring when they'd arrived. He was also willing to bet she had at least one skill similar to Apex Hunter, but aimed more towards fighting people instead of monsters. It being only an hour or so after noon, he wouldn't be able to rely on the force multiplier of his racial subtype, which meant the raw stats of having a unique class would probably be his only real advantage. Is this what you need to prove I am who I say I am? Velik asked Blenston. I'm afraid so. The portly nobleman nodded. He didn't appear any sort of apologetic, though. If anything, he was almost quivering with barely repressed glee. Yeah, he believes I'm gray. This is just so he can see a fight featuring his favorite gladiator up close. Velik turned his gaze to Jensen, who just shrugged. I told you he'd want some proof. That's the drawback of wearing a mask to hide your identity. Very well. I did not expect to fight a duel, however. Would you be willing to loan me a training spear? Tell it, Gillar called. Ma'am, he said back. He rushed into the equipment shed and returned a moment later with a blunt spear made of some dark, thick what he didn't recognize, and capped with a dull, vaguely pointed piece of iron. It gave more the impression of having a tip than it actually had one, but he supposed that was the point of a training weapon. The sword was similar, being made of dull iron that tapered to a gentle point. It was the same size as the one Gillar wore on her belt, which she was currently unbuckling and handing off to the trainee. With a gesture, she beckoned Velik to follow her into the middle of the sparring ring. You might want to take that mask off, she warned. Going to be hard to see your peripherals with it on, and I don't want any whining about it not being a fair fight. I appreciate the concern, but I'll be fine. If you're sure then. Tell it. Count us down. Ma'am, the trainee said again. He looked between Velik and his boss, took a breath, and said, 3, 2, 1, begin. Velik's weapon gave him the advantage in range, and he was confident that he had a high enough physical stat to properly leverage that against Gillar's shorter sword. In truth, he was more worried about the relatively fragile weapons holding up under the strain of repeated impacts. They were heavy iron, but he could bend his spear in half with his bare hands. If Gillar was anywhere near as strong, he suspected both weapons would deform when they were smashed together. As soon as the fight started, she burst forward so fast that Velik barely got the tip of his spear in place to stop her charge. I know they said no active skills, but if that's pure stats giving her that much speed, her class must weigh heavily towards that over raw strength. Or else she's cheating. He'd know soon enough. If she had the muscle to fend off his probing strikes, then she was either a much higher level than Apex Hunter thought, or she was dangerously over-specialized in physical. The blunted tip of his spear was lined up to force her to either impale herself on it or dodge it, though she was wearing armor. That might blunt the impact enough that she could ram the weapon, but even then, it'd hurt like hell. Except that didn't happen. She stuttered a single step to give herself an instant's time to smack the side of the spear just behind the head with her free hand. The tip wavered a few inches, not enough to matter in most cases, but it allowed her to twist her torso as her legs carried her forward and get her past the outside edge of his reach. Normally, he'd draw on his weapon's shape-shifting enchantment to overcome the disadvantage that exchange had put him at. Since the metal pole they'd given him didn't have any enchantments, he planted his feet and heaved the weapon as hard to the side as he could. It collided with Gillar's shoulder, drawing a grunt from her and sending her staggering, but not knocking her off her feet like he'd planned. Instead, she lunged forward with her arming sword, fast as any monster's snapping teeth. The sword was pointed right at his sternum, and she looked like she meant to run him through with it. Velik faded back a step and dodged to the side, bringing the back end of his spear around to parry the sword strike up high. Just like he'd suspected would happen, both the spear and the sword bent slightly from the impact. The two of them sprung apart, Gillar eyeing her weapon appreciatively, and Velik gripping his spear on either side of the bend. With a flex of his arms, he straightened the iron back out. It wasn't perfect like it had been, but it was a lot closer than if he'd left it alone. Giller snorted, reached one hand halfway up her arming sword, and twisted the metal back into shape. "Should have gotten out the stuff enchanted for durability," she said. "Too late now." And with that, she rushed in again. This time, Velik kept her back with a series of jabs. He had his work cut out for him, but Spear Warden was practically designed to do exactly what he was doing. Every thrust forced Giller to react in a specific way, and each attack built on the one that came before it until he took control of the battle. At least, that was how things normally worked. Fighting an enemy with hands was atypical for him, however, and he kept finding himself forced to make adjustments on the fly when Giller didn't merely dodge around his attacks. Her tendency to try to grab his weapon and take control back was annoying, especially because it turned out she was just as strong as she was fast. Another problem was that Savage Rhythm wasn't triggering for some reason, probably that his attacks weren't actually hitting her. He had the same problem with heavily armored monsters. If a spear didn't draw some blood, that didn't seem to be good enough for the skill. It was even worse in this fight, however, because she kept parrying or blocking his strikes. The fight stretched on from 1 minute to 2, and neither of them could gain an advantage over the other. Velik kept Giller back through raw strength and speed, combined with the sheer reach of his weapon, but her sword seemed to almost teleport around, always appearing at the last possible instant to block another strike. Gods, that's annoying. I think I prefer fighting things without thumbs. The whole time, Tellet observed from the sidelines, his eyes scouring the fight in an attempt to tally the score. Jensen and Blinston watched, the latter with his mouth agape as he struggled to keep up with the frenetic pace of the duel. The other trainees stared just as intently, though they were definitely keeping track of the action better than their boss was. Suddenly, Giller's arm whipped forward and her sword went spinning end over end. With only 5 feet of distance to clear, it struck Velik's chest before he could react. Pain flared and the sword bounced away at an angle that his opponent had somehow predicted. She was already darting off to the side to reclaim the weapon. "Point, Giller," the referee called. Velik ignored the man and the pain as he lunged forward, spear leading. Now that Giller had disarmed herself at that point, he knew he had a narrow window of opportunity to punish her for her eagerness. His spear flashed out, only to be blocked each time by her hand slapping it away. If he'd been using a real weapon, he'd have shredded her palm, but with a practice spear, there was no edge at all. It seemed a little unfair to him. He was technically making contact, but he supposed since it wasn't with the tip of the spear, Tellet wasn't counting it. That must have been some stipulation of their dueling rules, because Velik knew better than anyone that the shaft of a spear could do plenty of damage. Screw it. I don't even know the rules. I'll just avoid bashing her skull in and start treating this like a real fight. Giller seemed surprised by his sudden aggressive rush, but her mouth stretched into a gleeful smirk as he gave up the reach advantage to close in on her. Even though she hadn't managed to recapture her sword, she seemed more than willing to mix things up unarmed. That lasted all of 2 seconds until Velik started working his spear like a staff, striking at her with both ends. Her hands were a blur as she worked to fight off both ends of the weapon, but when he slipped a kick in that caught her knee with his heel, her leg slid out from beneath her. It was only a small misstep, barely even a tiny hop, but it was an opening, and Velik was ruthless in pressing the advantage. The tip of the spear struck her shoulder hard enough that the ring of iron on steel echoed through the whole courtyard, and he followed up with the base in whipping around to catch her hip while she tried to regain her balance. 2 points, Gray. The in without the point counts? Good to know. 1 more to go, and you're still disarmed, he thought. Giller gave up on recovering her sword and pressed in, too close for Velik to even use his spear. That wasn't a good situation for him. He already knew she outclassed him at hand-to-hand combat. If he couldn't keep a weapon between them, she'd overpower him immediately. Try as he might, he couldn't backpedal quickly enough to get out of her range. If he couldn't break off pursuit without taking a hit, the only choice he had left was to go on the offensive. This duel was about scoring points, not doing damage. That meant he didn't need enough range to get power behind his swings. He just had to hit her 1 more time. He waded back in, snapping the spear out in short chopping strikes. Once again, the lack of shape-shifting on his spear was limiting his options and making it harder for him to score a decisive blow, but he was confident he could win the duel. He just needed to push Giller off balance again, so he could get the last hit in. But that was easier said than done. He'd caught her off guard the first time, and she'd underestimated him when he'd switched up to fighting with a quarterstaff instead of a spear, but he already knew she was good. She wasn't going to fall for that trick again. If he wanted to cinch a victory, the best thing he could do now was lean into his overpowering strength and speed. His attacks sped up, and thanks to all the practice he'd had with savage rhythm, he was more than up to the task of chaining them together, even without the skill's help. Giller's grin turned into a frown of concentration as she worked to keep Velik at bay, then a snarl when he pushed her back another step. The tip of his spear swung around in an arc, only to be aborted at the last possible instant when she tried to duck under it and accidentally put her head right in line with the blow. Velik pulled back just short of clobbering her and mentally cursed the woman's clumsiness. Her fist connected with his gut at the same time he was stopping the momentum of his spear. She did it on purpose, he realized when he saw the smirk on her face. "Point Giller. Next one for the match," Tellet announced. Even as he spoke, Giller's other hand came around in a side punch aimed for his ribs. Velik could dodge it, but he'd be leaving himself open for a follow-up if he did. Instead, he pulled his spear over to deflect her knuckles. The bottom braced against his foot. Giller's punch came up short, almost like she'd expected the defense, and with his stance locked, he couldn't react quick enough to stop her from shouldering him. The armored plate smacked against his stomach and rocked him back on his heels. Last chance to get a hit. Abandoning the spear, he brought his hands up and clasped them together. His intention was to slam them down on her back and score the final point, but sharp pain in his hip told him he'd been too late. "Final point, Giller. The match is over," Tellet said. "Good match," Giller said a minute later after they'd both recovered. "Told you that you should have lost that mask, though." Considering that he hadn't even seen the blow that had scored her the last point, it was hard to argue with that logic. On the other hand, her stunt of deliberately putting her head in the way to force him to pull a blow seemed like the kind of thing that would have gotten her disqualified in an official duel. "Spectacular," Blenston said. "And you continue to impress, Captain Giller." She snorted. "Wasn't much of a fair fight. He's obviously not used to fighting people in duels or otherwise." "The Colosseum doesn't do those kinds of fights anymore," Jensen said. "Probably for the best," Blenston murmured. "But enough. I take it by the fact that you're not denouncing him that you're convinced of his identity." Giller looked Velik over for a moment, then shrugged. "He's a good fighter, probably a lot better when he's using a weapon he's familiar with. Whether he's your mystery gladiator, well, I don't have anything to compare him to. I can assure you," Jensen started to say, only to subside when Blenston waved him off. "I'm convinced. It was a spectacular performance, and nobody beats the captain anyway. That's the whole reason I pay her so much." Velik wasn't convinced that she'd win in a real fight, but then again, she undoubtedly had all sorts of tricks and abilities she hadn't revealed either. They were close in level, but she was 2 to 3 decades older than him. There was no reason to assume that didn't give her the advantage in skills merged, practical experience, and gear. "So why am I so damn annoyed that I lost? There's one thing, though," Blenston added, almost like it was an afterthought. "The skill you used on that monster last night." Velik caught Jensen's eye while the portly lordling hedged his way through his request. "You owe me big time for this. It's going to break something. Whatever you want me to hit shouldn't be anything you want to keep. Bring out one of the Darkstone targeting dummies," Giller snapped. 2 of the trainees rushed into the storage shed, then returned carrying what looked like a statue made of black, polished marble. Giller directed them to set it in the middle of the sparring arena and said, "These are commonly used by mages to practice spells without causing undue amounts of property damage. From what I heard, you shouldn't be able to break one with a single attack." That sounds like a challenge to me. Determined to win back some scrap of his pride after losing the duel, Velik hefted the bent and twisted practice spear in one hand. "You won't be getting this back," he warned. "Irrelevant. It's just a bar of scrap iron some apprentice blacksmith hammered into shape." Velik approached the statue and considered it for a moment. It was person-shaped but with no details. If they told him that some beginning sculptor had started carving out the excess stone on a statue they planned to make, then never finished beyond the initial shaping, he'd have believed them. More interesting was the material itself. The trainees had made it look heavy, and, judging by the fact that it had already sunk 3 inches into the dirt, he was guessing that wasn't an act. Can it really absorb magic, though? It seems like it would be far more widespread if it could. There has to be some sort of limit to it. In truth, that wasn't his problem, nor was he feeling particularly charitable. If they wanted to see a dreadlance, he'd blow this statue up and the ground it was planted in, too. Standing 8 feet away, he activated the skill. Energy started at his hand and flowed down the length of the spear as little arcs of light that jumped and skipped across the metal to gather in the tip. When he'd first made the skill from kinetic charge and phalanx, he'd struggled to control it. It had such a wide area of damage that he'd gotten caught in the blast several times. Since then, however, he'd advanced Dreadlance to rank 3, and that gave him far more precision. Velik thrust the spear forward until the dull tip tapped on the black stone chest of the statue. Penetration wasn't necessary, which was good, because he doubted he could put the training spear through regular stone, let alone the fancy, super heavy, magic-absorbing variety. Dreadlance exploded outward, disintegrating the front half of the spear and completely engulfing the statue. Various shouts of surprise came from the spectators behind him, which Velik ignored to focus entirely on the statue. "Come on, break! Break, damn you!" The light faded, revealing a cloud of black dust drifting around and a much smaller statue. Surprisingly, the general shape of it was intact somehow. He chalked that up to it being a magic stone that allowed it to survive, but had shrunk by 3 feet and was proportionally thinner. It wasn't what Velik had been going for, but it was something. "God save us," one of the trainees whispered. "That's over half the statue." "It'll take months to regrow," another one said. Giller said nothing, but Velik could feel her eyes boring into him. She hadn't been all that impressed by their duel, but the demonstration must have changed her mind. He tilted his head slightly and locked eyes with her for a moment, then turned his attention to Jensen. "If that will be all, I have other business to attend to today. I think that should satisfy your curiosity, wouldn't you say, Lord Blinsden?" "Quite so," the fat man agreed happily. "Then I'll leave you to the counting of your coins," Velik told them. He paused beside Jensen and whispered, "I don't enjoy performing for an audience. You'd better make sure this expedition ends up in Slokera if you want me in it. Send me a message with the details once you've got them figured out. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk." Velik was still waiting for Arya an hour after the time she'd said to meet him, and when she did show up, it was in a set of freshly laundered clothes more suitable for a noble's garden party than for traveling on the road. Her face was also reddening to match her hair, and he could smell the wine on her breath. "And she's supposed to be evaluating me. Oh, good. You're here," Arya said, her voice slightly slurred. "I've been here the whole time," he replied, trying to keep his patience intact. "You're the one who's late. That makes me smarter than you, then. This job is a punishment. Why would I be eager to start it? Sooner we begin, sooner we end." Arya snorted out a laugh. "Kid, you have no idea how miserable the next week or 2 of your life is going to be. You should have done what I did. Take a nice relaxing bath, drink a bottle of expensive and potent wine, and gotten laid." Velik froze, unsure how to even respond. "Too late now. Come on. Our carriage should be here soon." "Carriage?" he asked. "What? Did you think I was going to walk the whole way? I figured we'd run for most of it. Please spare me." "No, we'll let a good, high-level pair of horses take us there, and in a carriage enchanted for comfort. Don't worry, you can pay me back for your half of the rental fee later." Velik started to bristle at the presumption, but Arya just laughed and added, "I'm kidding. It's not that expensive anyway." "How much?" he asked almost begrudgingly. He had no idea what a gold-ranked monster hunter considered to be an expense. 100 dekarmos, plus an extra 30 for each week we're out there. He almost choked when she casually rattled off the sum. It wasn't even that he couldn't afford it, and easily, it was just the sheer waste. There'd been a time when gathering 100 Dekarmos would have taken him a week or more of work. They weren't even going that far, barely 200 miles. He could probably run it by dawn with a good road. Ah, there it comes now, Arya said, gesturing to a carriage drawn by two massive black horses that had a pair of spiraling ram's horns coming out of their skulls to curl down around their heads. Wait, aren't you going to bring any of your gear with you? Velik asked, tearing his gaze away from the horses to take in Arya's outfit again. It was hardly fit for a casual stroll through the forest, let alone Hydra hunting in a swamp. I've got everything I need, she told him. Besides, it's not my job to kill the Hydra. I'm just an observer. Now, come along. The carriage stopped in front of the guild hall, and Arya stepped up to it to hand the driver a small leather bag, presumably filled with Dekarmos. The man opened it and placed a hand inside, then nodded and hopped down to pull open the carriage door. Arya ascended one step up, then paused and looked back. I said, come along. Don't annoy me before we even get there. I am your evaluator, after all. You want to keep me in a good humor. First Jensen's business partner. Now this. Why did I want to come here again? The carriage ride was surprisingly comfortable, and the best part was that Arya decided she needed to take a nap, which meant Velik didn't have to keep her entertained for the first few hours. He spent some of that time going over his fight with Giller in his head again, trying to pick apart her fighting style to figure out where he'd made mistakes. It was obvious that she had plenty of experience battling against other humans, and he suspected it wasn't just from duels, either. That move where she'd taken advantage of the rules to maneuver him into a disadvantageous position was too ruthless to be something she'd picked up doing sport fighting. At the same time, if he'd made better choices earlier in the fight, she wouldn't have been in a position to use that trick. The simple truth of it was that Velik spent his time fighting things that were far stupider than him. Even the most cunning animal was still just an animal in the end, and very few monsters had anything approaching human-level intellect either, no matter how high their mental stats were. The few people he had been forced to fight had been overwhelmed simply due to things like level disparity, lack of a combat-oriented class, or subpar equipment. He'd never learned to fight somebody with weapon skills because it had never been necessary, and he was thinking that if he planned on fully abandoning his life as a recluse, he might need to do something to correct that deficiency. Even without any sort of personalized training, he could already think of 4 or 5 spots in the duel where he'd made poor decisions and given Giller an advantage. More practice would be a good start. But where do I find a sparring partner who can keep up with my strength and speed? Worse, I need to train both with and without my regular weapon, so it needs to be someone with the capability to match me while I'm fully kitted out. The guild probably had a handful of gold or platinum-ranked hunters who fit the bill, but those people were busy with their own lives, and the instructors and trainers for combat were laughably underqualified to serve as sparring partners. He could probably learn a few tricks, but practicing them at the speeds he worked at was another story. He cast a speculative glance at Arya, who was leaning up against the inner wall of the carriage and drooling into the shoulder of her dress while she snored softly. She was gold-ranked, and presumably wouldn't have much to do besides keep an eye on him. Maybe he could convince her to go a few rounds so that he could get a bit more practice fighting someone around his level. Apex Hunter didn't seem to be able to get a good read on her, other than to be sure that she was definitely over level 40, maybe as high as 45. The skill didn't seem to think she was that dangerous, even when he deliberately let his thoughts linger on attacking her. Normally, he'd think that meant she was weak for her level, perhaps a bad class. But in this case, he had a strong suspicion the truth was that she had a high mental blocking his intuitive appraisal of her skills. Almost as if she'd known he was looking at her, her eyes cracked open to meet his. With an indelicate snort, she said, "Kid, I'm old enough to be your mother." "You have a dirty mind," Velik told her bluntly. "I'm not interested in you or your sex life. What I'm interested in is how good of a hunter you are. Better than you. Maybe. Gods save me from stupid teenagers," she muttered. "Let me guess, you want to fight about it?" "I wouldn't say no to a friendly spar," he said. "Maybe this evening when we stop for the night." "We're not stopping. This carriage is going straight through the night until we get to the Harklovi swamps. There's a town perched on the north end that'll be our base of operations while we're there." "What's it called?" Velik asked. The briefing he'd received from the guild master had covered the Hydra itself the terrain, and what kind of problems he could expect. It hadn't mentioned the human settlements in the area at all, and had in fact left him with the impression that nobody lived there. In hindsight, that made no sense. If there were no people living in and around the swamp, there wouldn't be anybody to care about a hydra showing up there. Well, maybe that's not true. People still care about big, threatening monsters that are 100 miles away, just in case the monster decides to head in their direction. Hell if I know, Arya said. Starts with a G, I think. Look, here's the important part. You want to pass this thing? Make my stay here as pleasant as possible. Don't get anyone killed. Don't do anything that reflects poorly on the guild, and bring me back proof you killed the fucking Hydra. That's it. I don't care how you do it. I don't care about your technique. I just want to sit in my room at the inn, pretend I don't smell the overgrown mud puddle down the street, and then leave in a day or two once you're done. That's shockingly irresponsible, but then again, so what? It works out in my favor. And after all the shit the guild has already pulled in the last few months, I don't much care about them anyway. If this is all I have to do to pass this trial and get access to the information I want, then fine. I can do that. Deal. You stay out of my way. I'll go kill the monster, and we'll both go home happy. That's the spirit, Arya said with a wide smile. Now, as I said, the important thing here is keeping me comfortable. She raised a bare foot and dropped it down on his knee. Tell me, how are you at foot massages? Velik gave the offending foot an incredulous stare and shoved it off him. You couldn't pay me enough dekarmos. Faye, you say that, but everyone has their price. How, by all that the gods hold holy, is this woman a gold-ranked monster hunter? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Eldmerk, which definitely did not start with a G like Arya had claimed, actually reminded Velik strongly of the towns on the frontier. The houses were shaped a bit differently, and they were made with a different kind of wood, but it all had the same kind of hardiness he'd known his whole life. The walls were stone on built-up earthen embankments that were studded with thousands of sharpened stakes, all pointed outwards, and locals kept a careful watch on the screen of trees just beyond their borders. The carriage had rolled on all through the night, while Velik silently watched the world roll on by. He was sure he could have made the journey faster on foot, but he had to admit that it was nice to reach their destination and not be sore from running several hundred miles without a break. The company left something to be desired, however. He couldn't make heads or tails of Arya's behavior, and was more than half convinced that she was just screwing with him. The problem was that he couldn't tell if it was a way to amuse herself or if she was actually taking her role as his evaluator seriously and was testing him to see if he could remain professional in the face of her antics. It was now sometime around noon, and they stood in front of a sprawling, single-story building with an abundance of windows made out of something that clearly wasn't glass, but which light passed through anyway. It wasn't unique to that particular building, either, but Velik had no idea what it was. Arya noticed him peering at it curiously and said, "It's called Veil Stone. It's popular in warm climates because it's cheap and tougher than windows, but it's sensitive to cold temperatures, so you won't see it anywhere that get a lot of snow in the winter." Huh, so she's good for something after all. All right, I'll go get us a pair of rooms. The driver will take care of the carriage, and that leaves you to get started. Don't feel like you need to wait for me. Recognizing the words as a clear dismissal, Velik walked away from his evaluator. His first task was to find whoever was running Eldmerk and get an update on the situation with the Hydra. If there were no new developments, the posting was already 2 months old, so it was entirely possible something had changed. Then he'd see about getting the lay of the land and then going out into the swamp to search for it. Best case scenario, he'd find it just as the sun went down, hit it hard while at full strength, and drag back a head or two as proof of its demise. Nothing ever worked out that perfectly, however, so he was sure there'd be a complication or two before he reached the last step. Hopefully, Arya wouldn't hold it against him if it took longer than a single day to find the monster. From the way she'd talked, just finding the Hydra would be an issue, but the swamp was small enough that he was sure he could scour the whole thing in a single night. Hydras were huge and aggressive. It couldn't be hard to find one with a bit of work. Killing it, on the other hand, that might be a challenge. In his head, Velik knew that swamps were difficult to navigate. Footing was treacherous. There was a lot of water, and the whole place was infested with various forms of bugs that wanted nothing in the world besides to try to eat him alive. They weren't even monstrous insects, either, just regular old animals. None of it was a surprise. But even with all of areas whining to clue him in, he'd still vastly underestimated just how much it sucked to travel through the swamp. And that wasn't even taking into consideration the monsters. Why are there so many Morgus-cursed snakes living here? Couldn't the Hydra eat some of these things? He'd been walking for 2 hours now, or rather moving from dry spot to dry spot. They weren't easy to find, either. In some cases, he'd had no choice but to wade into hip-deep water across 100-foot-wide lakes of scum-covered, brackish black water. That was where predators liked to pull off their attempted ambushes, a tactic he was sure generally worked well for them. You have slain an arrow-back water snake, level 18. You have been awarded 1 to karma. The damn thing was practically invisible in the water, even to Velik's senses. He hadn't even realized it was there until it had tried to sink a pair of poisonous fangs into his leg. The bite failed to penetrate, of course. The monster just didn't have the physical strength to puncture his skin. That did not stop Velik from reaching into the water, grabbing hold of it, and hurling it into the air, where he sliced it in two on its way back down. A few minutes later, another snake tried the same thing, only to end up splattered against a nearby tree when he threw it. A nearby black bear, startled at the noise, gave Velik a somewhat panicked glance and ran off in the opposite direction. I wonder if there's some sort of water walking skill I could pick up. It didn't matter, not without an open skill slot to put it in. Burden of the Beast had been his choice after reaching level 40, but it was a skill he was somewhat hesitant about. It worked on a wide variety of monsters, but truthfully, he rarely needed it. A utility skill might have been the better pick, but those were so situational that he might never use whatever he ended up with. Once he got Savage Rhythm and Burden of the Beast folded into Spear Warden, though he was going to look at building a new utility skill with the 2 open slots. Velik's thoughts might have been a world away, focused on his build and what changes he wanted to make, but that didn't mean he wasn't paying attention. He was out of his element and being plagued by a cloud of gnats, mosquitoes, and the gods only knew what else. In an unfamiliar and hostile environment, searching for the undisputed king of swamp, he knew better than to let his guard down. That was why he was surprised when something rammed into him hard enough to knock him off his feet. It was only when he was completely underwater and his hand smacked up against tough, leathery skin that he realized what it was. Apex Hunter hadn't given him a warning beforehand, but it was yelling about the danger now. The monster exploded into motion, its jaws coming down on Velik and twisting to pull him deeper underwater. Unlike the water snakes, this time there was some power behind the teeth. They sunk into his flesh, not deep, but far enough that he couldn't pull himself free. He didn't bother to try. If the teeth were in his stomach, that meant the skull was within reach. He swept his spear out blindly in the right direction and felt it bite into flesh, though he wasn't sure if he'd hit the monster's skull or some other part of its body. Whatever it was, a deep, throaty growl filled the water as it dug down deeper. Trying to drown me won't work, Velik thought viciously as he slammed the spear into the monster again and again. And you're lacking the points in physical to win this. Partially because of the awkward angle and partially because he was underwater, Velik was having a hard time inflicting a killing blow, but Burden of the Beast kept activating, and the monster was struggling as the skill made it harder and harder to move. Unfortunately, that did nothing to get Velik free. Instead, they'd both sunk down to the bottom of the swamp and were partially buried in the mud. This might have backfired on me, he was forced to admit, but it wasn't like he could just turn the skill off. Skills didn't work that way. If they were active, like Dreadlance, he chose when to use them, but passive skills just worked whenever the conditions they were tied to were right. Savage Rhythm was also building up his speed with each successive strike, not that it did him much good at the moment. What he needed was to weaken the monster's jaw so he could escape. For that, his backup weapon was probably the better option. Unfortunately, it was pinned between what Velik was assuming was the monster's tongue and his back, making it impossible to get to without shoving his arm in between a set of teeth. Already got 10 or 20 of them sticking in me. What's a few more, right? He wiggled his hand down, scraping off skin as he reached down to his belt and slowly slid the dagger out of its sheath. It wasn't called the Sixth Plague for no reason, and he intended to demonstrate that. All of its enchantments were designed to cripple its victims, as the monster was about to find out. The dagger stabbed into its mouth, and again and again. Globules of black blood drifted through the water like drops of oil, too thick to properly mix in. At the same time, the grip around Velik's stomach started to slacken. The monster shook its head, probably trying to fight off the weakness enchantment it was being infected with, and its teeth slipped back out of Velik's torso. As happy as he was to be free to move around, he didn't want to lose track of what he had to assume was some sort of 30-foot-long reptile. As laughable as that seemed at first glance, he really couldn't see a damn thing underwater, and it was entirely possible the monster could just swim off. They didn't really ever tend to retreat, but the smarter ones could break off a failed ambush and try again later if he let them. Hopefully, it was just as stuck in the mud as he was. Despite its mouth opening up, Velik found that escaping out from between a set of teeth didn't actually get his head back above the water. No doubt, he could free himself easily if he put all his effort into the task, but he was more concerned about grabbing hold of the monster and not letting go. That was actually far harder than he'd anticipated, and not just because he couldn't see it. The damn thing was so big, getting an arm around it was like trying to hug a tree. He made contact, but there was nothing to grip. Any limbs it might have were far enough away from its head that he didn't feel them, and the monster was thrashing around, trying to drag itself out of the mud. Screw it. I've got skills and enchantments keeping it in one place. Just finish the job. His dagger slashed through leathery flesh a few more times, just to make sure the monster wasn't getting away. Then he sheathed the weapon and started digging his way free of the mud. A few seconds later, he surfaced and got a lungful of air along with his first look at what he was fighting. Most of it was still submerged, but the way it kicked and struggled was flinging water up everywhere. A tale that he wouldn't have believed belonged to the same animal if he couldn't trace it back to his own location, slapped against the surface a full 40 feet away from where he was standing, which he was only just now realizing was right along the edge of a far deeper lake. If I'd been a few more feet to the left, this thing probably couldn't even have gotten at me without breaching the surface. Just my luck. The magic of his dagger was holding for the moment, and that gave Velik all the time he needed. Taking up his spear in both hands, he widened the blade and drove it straight down into where he estimated the monster's skull was. It punctured through skin and bone with a satisfying thunk, but that only increased the wild flailing. Undeterred, Velik pulled his spear free and tried again. On the fourth try, a full 3 feet farther back than where he'd started, he finally hit something vital and got the kill notification. You have slain an elite Colossus Gator, level 31. You have been awarded 2 Dekarmas. So it wasn't that big because it was an elite then? I doubt I can even pull the corpse out of the water to get a good look at it. Arya was right. I hate this fucking place. The bed was lumpy and it stank, which was actually kind of amazing when Arya thought about it. The whole damn village reeked with that particular rotting odor unique to swamps. Despite that, they'd somehow scrounged up the audacity to provide paying customers with a mattress that smelled so distinctively foul from the air she was forced to breathe and that she hesitated to even sit on it. Please let that boy find that Hydra right away, she silently prayed, casting that thought off to whatever god was listening. Torwin had assured her that the new recruit was strong enough to be a gold-ranked monster hunter, and they both predicted that the guild would find some way to try to use that to its advantage. She hadn't expected to be handling this all on her own, but Torwin had been sent off within a week of arriving, and the assignment they'd stuck him with was every bit as tedious as he'd expected it to be. It was the kind of work a good team of Silvers could have handled, leaving no doubt in anyone's mind that he was being punished for his apprentice not gaining the right class. 20 years ago, when she'd been a fresh-faced teenager just beginning to explore the power her own star-fated conjurer class had granted her, the guild hadn't been like this. It had stood for something back then, back before the reforms started flowing out from the main headquarters in Ashala. The senior members of the guild had been given 2 choices: get on board or get out of the way. Those that had tried to fight had found themselves isolated, unsupported, and given the most dangerous missions. It broke her heart to see how the guild behaved today, to know that they were going out of their way to drive off fresh talent with no care for what it would cost the people of Gestal, also that they could play their stupid games. And it was absolutely infuriating that she was stuck playing those games, too. All that having been said, Torwin had better have been right about how good a hunter Velik was, because Arya was not planning to linger in Eldmerk a single second longer than she had to. She'd agreed to get herself placed on a list of examiners to protect Velik from the guild's machinations when they forced the gold-ranked examination on him, but she hadn't expected to be sent out to the Harklovi swamps as part of the deal. With one more distasteful glance at the bed, was that a bug that just crawled out of the sheet? She settled into a cross-legged position and began channeling the power of Horizon Seer. The skill was an amalgamation of various scrying magics, limited primarily by how much mana it took to maintain it. As Arya was completely fresh from napping through the long carriage ride, she was more than capable of spying on her charge for a few hours. It was the work of minutes to find him, roughly 20 miles deep into the swamp already. Considering it had been less than 2 hours since he'd set out, she was mildly impressed. The number of dead monsters he'd left in his wake, however, was downright disturbing. Apparently, the locals weren't concerned with thinning out the local monster populations. Maybe that's how a Hydra managed to grow to be such a problem in the first place. She watched him get ambushed by an absolutely massive reptile and briefly wondered if she'd be forced to intervene, but Velik surfaced a few seconds later and murdered the monster with extreme prejudice. There was a line of puncture marks from its teeth across his stomach, but it didn't seem to slow him down. He eyed up the gator for a moment after it died, then shrugged and kept walking. He's confident in himself. I know that thing caught him by surprise, but he's showing no hesitation wading back into the water. Not worried about infections, either. He didn't even bother to clean up the bite mark. I bet his physical is over 100 already. Over the next hour, Velik pushed deeper and deeper into the swamp. He kept to dry land when he could, but didn't shy away from going swimming when he didn't have any other way forward. All manner of swamp critters were stupid enough to attack him, and he was merciless in dealing with them. Nothing was strong enough to offer him a challenge. But then, the main danger of the swamps had always been in navigating it. She'd thought him stupid to set off with over half the day's light already wasted, but hadn't bothered to try to talk him out of it. As afternoon turned into evening, he showed no signs of slowing down, making her wonder what exactly his skill set was that he was so comfortable working alone after dark. Nobody was required to reveal their status or build to the guild, thankfully. That was one change at least that everybody had rejected. Still, it left her curious enough that as her mana started to dry up, she shifted into a cycle of cosmic meditation and Horizon Seer to keep spying on him. Eventually, the sun vanished, and her charge was left with nothing but the faint light of a quarter moon to see by. Far from her expectations, he didn't slow down. If anything, he started moving even faster. His course took him to the heart of the swamps, a decent place to start his search, and then he started moving outward in a spiral pattern until he finally came across what he was looking for: Hydra tracks. Hydras were amphibious, with short, powerful legs ending in webbed feet, which meant that their bellies tended to drag across the ground when they were on land. The rut this one had carved through the mud was so obvious, a blind man could have followed it. Good. Perfect. Find this thing and kill it. We'll be back home without me ever having to touch that disgusting mattress, she thought to herself as she watched. It wasn't that easy, unfortunately. So far from the edges, the swamp was more disgusting, fetid lakes of brackish black water than it was dry land. Velik was persistent, however, and more than capable of scaling a few trees growing around the edges of the water. He followed the Hydra's trail as it went in one lake and out the other, circling around each one until he'd picked it back up again. Finally, he came to a stretch of water a quarter-mile wide. The trail went cold there, despite circling the whole lake multiple times. Arya watched through her magic as Velik stood at the edge of the water and stared into it. It was easy to picture what he was thinking. The reason he couldn't find the Hydra's trail was that he'd come to the end of it. It was likely submerged in the middle of the lake somewhere, perhaps sleeping. Or maybe it was watching him, waiting for him to step into the water where it would have the advantage when it attacked. Don't be that stupid. I know I said I wanted this over as quickly as possible, but do not chase a God's Curse Hydra underwater and fight it there. Just be patient. It'll come out eventually to scrounge for food. Of course, however talented Velik might have been, he was still a relatively inexperienced hunter. After pulling some trinket out of his pocket and staring at it for a few minutes while he paced back and forth around the edge of the water, he sighed, summoned that curious spear of his off his arm, and waded in. Damn it. Now I have to go save his dumbass. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Velik was annoyed. He'd kind of been expecting it to come to this, but he'd been really hoping to catch the Hydra out on the hunt. Instead, he'd found its lair. It had only been dark for a few hours, but given the famous regenerative powers of the monster he was hunting, he wanted as much time as possible to slowly wear it down. If it decided to just wait him out, he might be stuck facing it without the benefits of Duskbound to help. He had two possible ideas for baiting the Hydra out. The first was to draw its attention with a lot of noise and maybe some monster corpses to play to its appetite. The problem there was that Hydras didn't actually eat all that much for creatures their size, and they were prone to hibernating at odd times. He didn't think this one was going to be down for a long time, not with how fresh its tracks were, but it could be anywhere from a few hours to a few days of waiting for it to show itself. Or he could swim down there and jab it with his spear. That'd piss it off, but that strategy came with the downside of having to find a way to get back out of the water. Well, with Burden of the Beast helping him to slow the Hydra down, he was sure he could manage something. This thing is definitely going to bite me at least once or twice, though. Stupid Hydra. Stupid Monster Hunters Guild. Stupid Arya. With a sigh, he willed his spear to slide down his arm and extend to its full length. Then he waded into the water. Somewhere just off-center of the middle of the lake, a sleeping monster was waiting for him. When he'd started his trip through the swamp, Velik had been essentially blind in the water. The smells were overpowering, the sounds were all new and unknown, and of course he couldn't see a damn thing through the layer of scum coating the black water. Actually being underwater was even worse, at least at first. After a few hours, he'd started to figure things out, though. It wasn't about sight or sound when he was down there. It was touch. Specifically, it was feeling the water sweeping past him and deciphering what was caused by his own movements and what was something else. Small monsters still eluded him. Things like the many snakes that were no longer than his arm and killed with their potent venom. Bigger monsters, however, like those massive gators and hopefully one swamp hydra, were a lot easier to detect once they started moving. That didn't help much with the gators, who had a tendency to float motionless in the water until he was already close enough for them to try to bite him. But he'd figured out how to spot them through other means when they were floating on the surface. With his newfound knowledge of blind aquatic navigation to supplement Apex Hunter, he expected to quickly figure out where the Hydra was sleeping. That didn't happen. After 2 minutes of swimming, in fact, he hadn't been attacked by anything, not even the normal water snakes, razor-scaled fish, steel-shell turtles, or colossal gators other lakes had boasted. Another sign that I'm in the right place. Nothing is stupid enough to try to live here anymore. But where's the Hydra at? Even asleep, it wouldn't be motionless. He should have been able to feel something, unless it had some sort of stealth skill like he suspected those gators had. Velik hadn't considered something that big and aggressive would have a stealth skill in its build, but anything was possible. Hydras weren't known as ambush predators, so it had seemed unlikely until he'd gotten underwater and realized he couldn't find the damn thing. For a few minutes, he just floated there, silent and still while he waited for something to come attack him. When nothing did, he started swimming forward again. His mana compass wasn't doing the best job at pointing toward the Hydra, probably because it didn't have much in the way of mana to begin with, though there'd been some weird interference he hadn't been able to get rid of the entire time he'd been out in the swamp. His best guess was that the place was magical itself, except that didn't really add up. He'd already run into places like that, and knew how to adjust the compass's settings to ignore area magic. Something else was probably going on, but he couldn't figure out what, and he had more important things to focus his attention on. Swimming while holding a spear, wearing boots, and being weighed down by a wet cloak wasn't exactly easy, but he was managing. The plan had been to draw the Hydra into the shallows, but that had failed immediately, so he resolved himself to go deeper into the middle. Velik proceeded carefully, but there was still nothing. Even when he touched down at the bottom of the lake, all he felt was cold mud, silt, and slime. Where's this thing? It has to be in here somewhere. Velik swam across the bottom of the swamp, one hand trailing through the muck in hopes of finding a footprint or a belly scraping, though he doubted either existed. With the water this deep, the Hydra would be able to swim to wherever it had settled in. Then his fingers brushed across something that wasn't mud. It was hard and unyielding, surprisingly warm in the chill swamp water, and unless Velik very much missed his guess, it was covered in scales. Of course, it buried itself in the bottom of the swamp. No wonder I can't feel it moving around in the water. Technically, it's in the mud. He'd have grinned if the thought of opening his mouth and letting swamp water in didn't disgust him. Instead, he just grabbed hold of his spear and brought it around, tip pointed down. He was about 200 feet from dry land, and the water was a good 30 feet deep. Once he started this fight, getting back to solid ground was going to be a challenge. Apex Predator was confident that he'd be fine. The Hydra was powerful, but Velik had fought worse. He steadied his grip, spared a thought to wonder if he should have tested how being underwater might react with the skill, then unloaded Dreadlance into the slumbering monster. Astral Gateway was Arya's newest skill, and still at rank 1. It was so expensive that she needed a mana potion just to refresh her reserves enough to cast it. The skill also took a while to set up, 3 full minutes, making it impractical for live combat. She hadn't thought she'd need it this time, but she kept the skill on the edge of her mind just in case. The skill finished building the door, a jagged tear of the world filled with stars and the infinite velvety blackness that separated them, and Arya walked through. Immediately, her nose was assaulted by the foul stench of the swamp. Here in the heart of the place, it was many times stronger than it had been back in her room at the inn. If the Hydra doesn't kill him, I will, she muttered as her eyes scoured the scum-covered pond in front of her. Somewhere under the surface, the world's stupidest monster hunter was swimming to his own demise, but he couldn't hide from Horizon Seer. Just as she went to activate the skill, something exploded a few hundred feet away. A plume of water shot 300 feet straight up, easily clearing the tallest of the twisted swamp trees. A few moments later, Arya found herself thoroughly drenched from a brief, muddy shower. Even if the Hydra does kill him, I will find a way to bring him back just so I can kill him again, she amended her earlier promise. Cosmic meditation wasn't just for mana regeneration. It was in reality an alternate state of existence that gave her quite a few useful perks. One of those perks was a form of limited levitation. It wasn't exactly quick, but it beat swimming. Arya activated the skill and rose off the ground a few feet, then willed herself forward. Starlight swirled around her body, which resembled nothing so much as a dark, misty silhouette as she drifted across the water. It roiled beneath her, great waves rising up to slap against the shore as the Hydra thrashed around. Torwin had warned Arya about Velik's offensive skill, a great burst of energy that had a tendency to reduce whatever he hit with it to ash. She'd obviously underestimated just how strong that skill was, but against a Hydra, she knew it wouldn't be enough. If it hadn't already completely healed up from the attack, it would in the next few seconds. That meant she had, at best, a very brief window to fish Velik out of the water and throw him to the shore. Before she could find him, however, something else caught her attention. A Hydra skull was usually about a foot wide when fully grown, maybe a foot and a half in a particularly large specimen. It was perched on a well-muscled and flexible neck, and depending on what particular type of Hydra it was, could spit out a variety of unpleasant liquids or gases. No less than 6 heads breached the surface, and every one of the skulls was twice the size she'd expected to find. That is a big damn Hydra. Suddenly worried about her own safety as she got her first good look at the monster they'd been sent out to take care of, Arya reversed her flight and used Horizon Seer to try to find Velik amidst the chaotic, churning water. A moment later, A second explosion threw the Hydra completely clear of the water, thankfully not in her direction. It was airborne for a good 3 seconds, revealed in its full, glorious bulk, before it executed the ultimate belly flop and submerged itself once again. Arya was, of course, thoroughly soaked a second time. She was so busy gaping that she hardly even noticed. Did he just throw a multi-ton monster out of a lake? How the hell did he do that? A moment later, Velik burst out of the water, his spear leading as he swam with superhuman speed. Somehow, he threw himself upward, his whole body twisting like a fish, and his cloak billowed out behind him. He rolled across the air like it was solid ground, got his feet under him, and took 3 great steps before launching himself into a jump with his spear leading as he slipped back into the water again. Arya was starting to think she'd underestimated this hunter. She'd known he was good enough to qualify as a gold-ranked, if only because Torwin had vouched for him, and that old codger was difficult to pry any sort of praise out of, but his description of Velik's capabilities hadn't included this. That Hydra was level 42 and an elite, judging by the size of it. She'd met a few Platinums who would have struggled to fight it on dry land, let alone underwater. There's more to killing a Hydra than just bullying it for a minute at the start of the fight. Let's see how you do when you start to run out of steam and it's ready to keep going full tilt for hours still, she decided as she settled back to watch. Unless Velik had a few more surprises up his sleeve, he wasn't winning this fight anytime soon. The book-learning portion of Velik's training as an iron-ranked monster hunter hadn't been especially helpful. It made sense that the bestiaries focused primarily on low-level threats, as those were what the trainees would be expected to handle upon their graduation of bronze. He'd dutifully learned how to recognize them, how to track them, and their strengths and weaknesses for what it was worth. The simple truth of the matter was that Velik didn't need to be clever or skilled to handle those kinds of problems, not at his current level. The problem was those books didn't talk about monsters like Hydras, and while he'd done a bit of self-studying and found some casual references in the books he had access to, most of what he was trying to learn was restricted and wouldn't be made available to him until he was a higher rank in the guild. That meant he knew a few broad strokes details about what he was currently fighting and not a lot of specifics. That's more than I usually know about a new monster, so I can work with this, he thought to himself as he blasted the Hydra out of the water with a combination of Dread Lance and the Power Surge enchantment on one of his rings. The monster didn't go far, but it did land in the shallow end of the swamp, which was good enough for his purposes. Rather than try to swim after it and risk giving it time to fully submerge itself again, he leaped as high out of the water as he could go and used his Cloak's Air Walk ability to pull himself clear. The draw on his mystic stat was intense, too much for him to get more than a few steps, but that was all he needed. Velik leaped forward, his spear leading, and descended on the Hydra while it was still struggling to orient itself. It was fully under the black water again, but only because it was stretched out on its belly. The moment it got its legs under its bulk and heaved upward, its back crested the surface. Immediately, columns of muscled, scaly flesh rose between Velik and the main body. 10 of them, more than I thought. The heads seemed to weave around each other without ever getting tangled up, though the reality was more that they just lashed back and forth in a complex pattern that Velik could only see small pieces of. The Hydra was incredibly, effortlessly coordinated, and its heads looked in every direction at once. There was no sneaking up on it now that it was awake, so Velik didn't even try. He'd hit it with Dread Lance twice now, and while both injuries still showed on its body, the pits of raw, bloody flesh were already closed over. New skin had grown across the wounds, and muscle was beginning to swell beneath the sagging flesh. Despite that, the Hydra wasn't moving with nearly as much alacrity as he'd expected. Healing such massive wounds had taken some sort of toll on it. Unfortunately, using the powerful skill twice in quick succession had drained Velik as well. He needed a bit of time to recover before he could unload a third shot in the monster, but he was hoping that it wouldn't be needed. His spear had a powerful enchantment on it that he rarely got any use out of called Mana Drinker. It served the dual purposes of empowering the other enchantments on the weapon and depriving his enemies of the mystical strength they needed to use certain abilities. With any luck, The Hydra's potent regeneration was one of those abilities. Velik landed on the Hydra's back and immediately set his weapon spinning in defensive twirls, the head of the spear flashing dangerously to fend off the snapping maws of the great monster. He cut it over and over, only for the injuries to seal up before his eyes in the next second, and did his best to keep from being trapped between the writhing necks or bitten by their sharp fangs. Burden of the beast seemed to be working, at least insofar as the main bulk of the beast slowly sagged back into the water. The heads, on the other hand, whipped about as quickly as always, keeping Velik on his toes and forcing him to activate his cloak's walk enchantment a few times to steady his balance on the unstable platform that was the Hydra's back. Despite how hard he was pushing the monster, things seemed to be settling into a stalemate. Velik got another Dreadlance off, this time blowing 3 of its heads clear the body at the neck, but that didn't seem to actually slow the Hydra down. New heads started to emerge from the stumps, though not so fast that he was immediately worried about them. He was so focused on what he was doing that he didn't notice Arya, sitting cross-legged, floating 2 feet above the mud, at the edge of the water until one of the Hydra's legs gave out and it rolled sideways. Velik was forced to shift position, and that brought his evaluator into view. What did she get here? He wondered to himself, but the Hydra was far too aggressive for him to have time to dwell on it. Half an hour went by. The Hydra got slower and weaker as Velik's skills slowly chipped away at it. Its regeneration slowed down, and as it lost a few more heads to another Dreadlance, he eventually wore it down to the point where he'd cut off all of its heads and it couldn't regrow them fast enough to be a threat. With its main body immobilized under the strain of burden of the beast, the Hydra was essentially defeated. Defeated but not dead. Now, how do I fix that? He was submerged up to his chest, still standing on the Hydra's body and severing the regrowing stumps by feel alone. The stories hadn't exaggerated its regenerative powers in the slightest, and Velik was truthfully at a bit of a loss. His spear's mana drinker didn't seem to be making much of a difference, at least not anything he could see. Now that things had calmed down, Arya floated over to speak to him. He eyed her curiously as she skimmed across the surface of the swamp, her clothes stained with murky water somehow despite never actually touching anything. Even her hair had a film of pond scum stuck in it. "You're done, then?" she asked, her tone icy. "Well, no. I haven't gotten a kill notification for it yet." Eyes widening, she shot a worried look down into the water. "It's still alive? You just subdued it." "Yeah. I've been cutting off the new heads as they grow out of the stumps, so they don't have time to become a threat again." "That is certainly a novel way to deal with the threat. How long do you intend to keep playing with it?" "I'm not playing with it," Velik said. "I just don't know how to stop its regeneration. I'd hope that doing a massive amount of damage to it would wear it down, but that doesn't seem to have worked. Gods above, did you do no research before coming out here? You knew what you were hunting," Arya accused. "I'm not allowed access to that information," Velik told her. Believe it or not, the iron-ranked bestiaries stop at recognizing the signs a Hydra is in the area and advise as a strategy to run like hell and get someone else to deal with killing it. The gold-ranked hunter opened her mouth to say something, paused, and sighed. "Okay, fair enough. I suppose I've been a bit lax on making sure you were properly prepared for all of this. I just assumed Bertram explained everything you'd need to know after I left. The first thing to do is get it completely out of the water. You can manage that." "If I have to," Velik said slowly. He eyed up the distance to the edge of the Black Lake and added, "Why do I need to do that? The way to stop a Hydra from regenerating is to cut out its heart. The closer you get to that organ, however, the quicker it regenerates. Fire slows it down but doesn't stop it. Acid sometimes works, but not against swamp hydras. So we need to get it on a dry land, build a fire, and throw the body into it. Once it's burning, then you can carve it open and remove the heart." Velik absently stabbed his spear through a neck that had grown out 2 feet in length while they were talking while he considered the problem. He could probably strong-arm the Hydra's main body out of the water eventually, but keeping its heads from regrowing at the same time would be an issue. It seemed to him that the only real reason to do that was because Arya wanted to cook the damn thing to slow its regeneration down, though. Let's say I was strong enough to beat the regeneration on this monster and could extract its heart where it is now. That would work, right? In theory. Arya hedged. You're massively underestimating how difficult a task that is. Trust me when I say we're going to need the fire. Okay, well, I'm going to try it here first. Otherwise, half the heads will have grown back by the time I get it moved, and I'll be fighting it all over again. If that doesn't work, we'll do it the hard way. Arya looked like she was about to start arguing with him, but she thought better of it. Instead of saying anything, she threw her hands up in the air and started to drift backwards. Do what you want, she told him after she came to a stop. It's your hunt. I'm just here to evaluate how you go about it. Grinning, Velik got to work. I cannot believe you pulled that off, Arya said flatly, while holding out a massive glass jar she'd pulled out of seemingly nowhere. I told you I could, Velik said, though in truth having to find that particular organ blindly had been a chore. He'd pulled out. He wasn't even really sure what organs they were, but half a dozen of them were settling into the muck around the corpse before he'd finally gotten the right one, evidenced only by the system notification informing him he'd slain a level 42 swamp wraith hydra. How exactly that differed from a normal hydra was unclear, but he figured it meant something. He placed the heart in the jar gently. Arya sealed it up and considered it for a moment, then nodded to herself when the whole thing vanished. That's a big one. I know an alchemist that'll pay at least 3,000 dekarmos for that. I can broker the sale for you if you want, for a 30% commission. If it's that valuable, it seems like I should just hold on to it until I can sell it myself, Velik said. You don't strike me as the type to know the market. I doubt you've got anything close to my connections. I bet you'd still make more money if I sold it for you at the price I could get than if you try to sell it yourself, Arya argued. Maybe if your commission was 15%. The woman's eyes narrowed and she snapped out, 25. I'd be willing to go as high as 18, Velik shot back. It wasn't even that he needed the money. It was just that Arya had annoyed him and he didn't feel like letting her have it for free. In truth, he hadn't realized the hearts were valuable at all. He probably would have thrown it back into the swamp if she hadn't produced the jar like she was expecting it. At first, he thought she just wanted proof of the kill until she'd mentioned selling it. 20, Arya said. Velik opened his mouth to argue, but she beat him to it and added, 20, and I'll use my magic to get us both back to Eldmerk right now. That wasn't hard to agree to. He'd been in the swamp for the better part of 12 hours, and while he was sure he could find his way back out on his own, he wasn't really in the mood. Deal, he said. Excellent choice. Don't tell anyone at the guild. Technically, getting back is part of the exam. Making a deal with someone who isn't your evaluator to transport you is one thing, but me using my magic to help is a gray area. Velik laughed. I'll keep it to myself. He didn't give a rat's ass about the guild's rules. Truthfully, he'd had about all he could stand of the place, and the only reason he hadn't already walked out was that he'd wasted the better part of 4 months getting to where he was now. He knew there was information about rare and unique classes and dungeons, too, in their archives. Torwin had promised to fetch that information for Velik, but then the old ranger had gotten himself sent out on some sort of punishment job before Velik had even shown up. Arya pulled on some skill, and a patch of starry night sky unfolded in front of her. After you, she said, gesturing him through the hole in reality. Bemused, Velik stepped through and found himself in a room with a ratty old bed tucked into the corner and nothing else. He could hear other people nearby, snoozing the night hours away. That's a nice skill. Why do we ride out here in a carriage if she could just do that? I need a bath, Arya said as she followed Velik through her skill and let it fold close behind her. Wrinkling her nose, she added, You need one worse. I am not sitting in a carriage with that for a day and a half. Come on, let's get cleaned up, then we can discuss your performance. Wondering what exactly there was to discuss, Velik followed his evaluator out into the hallway and down to the common room, where she obtained directions to the bathhouse with assurances that they weren't just using dirty swamp water to fill their tubs. She gave the innkeeper, who she'd dragged out of the kitchen where he'd been preparing the morning's bread, a somewhat suspicious look at his attempts to reassure her, but conceded that they didn't have a better option. His questions about how exactly they'd gotten so filthy to begin with were brushed aside as she swept out into the streets, Velik in tow. They found the bathhouse quickly enough, which included a laundering service. The water was clean, which was all Velik wanted, but he could hear Arya complaining incessantly from the next room over that it wasn't warm enough while the sleepy attendant murmured apologies. By the time he was done scrubbing himself, the water was a murky brown. Fortunately, the attendants had thought ahead and provided him with a bucket of clean water to sluice himself off with and a coarse robe to wear while he waited for his clothes to be returned. He'd kept an ear on the washer lady, mostly because she was handling tens of thousands of dekarmos worth of gear. Everything except the cloak would clean itself eventually, but it didn't hurt to speed things up. Strangest thing, the washer lady said when he reclaimed his gear. The grime just seemed to fall right out of it. It's barely even damp after I wrung it all out, too. Well, except for this. She handed him the raven's feather cloak with its thick cowl and feathery stitch pattern, as clean as it could get but still sodden and dripping. The cloak lacked mending, a sacrifice he'd made in order to get a hefty boost to his mystic so that he could afford to use its other enchantments, Shadow Step and Airwalk. "Thank you," he said, leaving a small stack of silver vitrions behind as payment for dragging her out of her bed at such an early hour. Freshly cleaned and in mostly dry clothes, he waited for Arya to catch up to him. Unlike his own efforts, she took considerably longer to finish up, so much so that if he couldn't hear her still complaining inside, he might have thought she'd abandoned him while he was tending to his own business. Eventually, she did reappear, her face and hair scrubbed clean of all traces of the swamp, and wearing a completely different outfit that he'd never seen before. It's got to be some sort of extra-dimensional storage space, he decided. Torwin had mentioned them to Velik once, but lamented the price tag attached to the enchantments. When he'd looked them up for himself, and saw prices in excess of 200,000 dekarmos for what amounted to essentially an extra travel pack space, he'd decided his money was better spent elsewhere. Given what he'd seen of Arya's storage capacity so far, he was starting to wonder just how rich the woman was and what other surprises she might have in store for him. He never met anyone with class skills like hers before, at least not that he was aware of. No doubt he'd bumped into a few mage types in the guild hall, but they hadn't stopped to explain their builds to him. Even among the iron ranks, mages were rare. Their skills were supposed to require a lot of planning and were finicky to merge, leaving a reckless mage stuck with no versatility to make up for all the points they'd spent on mystic and mind. Without a strong physical to back them up, it was hard to survive the rigors of combat. Would-be monster-hunting mages who weren't cautious or lucky didn't tend to live long enough to make it to gold-ranked. Apex Hunter didn't have Arya pegged as someone who was all that stronger than him, but looks could be deceiving. In a slugging match, he'd probably win, but something told him Arya wouldn't ever let him get close. If it came down to it, his best strategy would probably be to disappear and then ambush her before she could find him again. "All right, now that we only reek of the normal stink of this pisswater town," Arya began, "let's talk about how you did and what I'll be reporting back to the guild. Then, the second the sun goes up, we'll let whoever's in charge know that the job is done. Then climb in the carriage and be gone from this place." Velik didn't think it was as bad as she made it out to be, but he certainly wouldn't argue with putting some distance between his nose and the swamp. Just because he'd gotten used to the smell didn't mean he was enjoying it. There was nothing to be done about that for the moment, however, so he focused his attention on the other part of her statement. "What's there to say? I went out. I found the Hydra. I killed the Hydra. It took less than a day to take care of. And that certainly counts for a lot," Arya said. "But it's not all you're being graded on. Relax. You passed. At least, that's what I'll report back. I'm sure they'll argue over the finer points, and people like Peveril will try to use it as an excuse to deny your advancement. But as far as I'm concerned, you did the job." That having been said, there were a few things that could have gone better. Let's start with walking into a swamp and staying there all night. The two of them were in the carriage, riding back to Cravel and discussing the state of the guild, to which Arya would be giving her recommendation that Velik be raised to the rank of gold. Just because she'd evaluated him as ready to take on gold jobs didn't mean it would actually happen, however. Unsurprisingly, Arya wasn't any more of a fan of the guild's political games than Velik was. She didn't like getting caught up in them, and she didn't have anything good to say about the guild's leadership for allowing them to happen. In all fairness to Bertram, He inherited a mess and wasn't given a choice. The politics aren't some local thing. Cravel is a major branch of the Monster Hunters Guild, right behind Ashala and Vestal. If Bertram didn't play along, they'd just remove him and put someone else behind his desk, she explained. That doesn't mean he's bad at it or unwilling to play politics, just that I believe if he had his way, the guild would be run differently, which is a meaningless distinction. He doesn't have his way, nor does he have the principles to stand up to the actions of those who would abuse their positions for their own gain, Velik pointed out. So he's a worthless guild master. He's not worthless. He just folds to pressure more often than some of us would like. Worthless, Velik said again with a snort. If you don't like it, this probably isn't the guild for you, Arya told him primly. In fact, no guild is probably the guild for you. Politics are a part of civilization. Well, I'm not here because I want to be, Velik said. Then why are you here? If you don't care, why go kill the Hydra? Why make me come along to watch? I could have stayed home. The guild has knowledge I want. This was the only way to get it. Once I have it, Velik shrugged. He couldn't care less if he was in good standing once they'd served their purpose. Back when he'd first joined, he'd had some ideas about becoming a professional monster hunter. He already knew he was good at it, and if taking jobs to go kill monsters had been the extent of the guild, he would have happily stayed on. The team he'd been assigned had been an unpleasant surprise. Their instructors were another one. The iron trials and politics had worn out what remained of Velik's patience. If this evaluation turned against him, he'd just follow this lead with the flesh beast and use Jensen's expedition to get there. When he got back, Torwin could get him what information the guild had that was useful. Had he known how much of a pain in the ass the guild was going to be, he'd have left it to Torwin to handle that part in the first place. Don't say anything like that to anyone when we get back, Arya advised. Assume they already know, but if not, best not to tell them. It'll just be one more thing they hold against you. You're not going to tell them? Nah, fuck Peveril. Velik considered that statement for a moment. Agreed. Despite everything, Arya was starting to grow on him. She was still sort of aggravating, but her irreverence for the people running the guild was refreshing. The fact that she'd promised a passing grade, especially after he'd explained how he functioned better at night, and that nobody had given him the knowledge about his specific target that he was supposed to receive, helped matters along. She plopped a foot on his knee and wiggled her eyebrows suggestively. Velik smacked the offending limb away with a scowl. Hasn't grown on me that much. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Barely 3 days, Arya said, and most of it spent traveling. I don't think anyone expected us to get back that quickly. That'll be another mark in your favor. Great, Velik said, unenthused about the whole thing. In a perfect world, they'd do their deliberating somewhere far away from him, then someone would come give him his pin. He'd get access to the guild archives, and then he'd never set foot in the guild again once he'd learned what he wanted to know. In reality, according to Arya, he'd be called on to present himself to answer questions so they could publicly come to whatever consensus they'd already reached behind closed doors when they made their deals with each other. It would take hours and be utterly pointless, since the votes had already been bought and paid for long before the meeting ever started. I don't want to do any of that. I wonder if I could get away with just disappearing for a month or two. I guess I should find Jensen and ask him when we're going. The Vault Seeker had promised to leave some contact information in Velik's mailbox with the guild, so he reluctantly followed Arya inside to claim that. They parted ways immediately, with her going to drop off her report and him going to the mailroom. As promised, there was a card waiting for him with the address to an inn called the Crystal Monocle. It was, of course, located in Goldtown. There were still a few hours of daylight left, so Velik headed across the city to let Jensen know he was back. He had no idea if he'd find the other man there, but he figured he could leave a message if nothing else. While getting passage across the border was convenient for Velik, participation in his expedition was mandatory for Jensen. He'd have to find Velik if he wanted things to progress. The Crystal Monocle was stunningly decadent, at least to Velik's eyes. The wood was sanded smooth and polished. The glassware was so clear as to be almost invisible, and food was served on literal silver and gold platters. Whatever it was they were offering for lunch smelled incredible, but Velik didn't need to see the menu to know he wouldn't like the prices. If he's having trouble getting funding, Why is he staying at a place that's probably costing him 20 or 30 dekarmas a day? Either I am completely misunderstanding the scale of this operation, or he's being stupidly wasteful. Probably both. It seemed the hostess agreed with Velik's assessment that the Crystal Monocle was too rich a place for him to be in. Before he'd gotten even 2 steps past the threshold, she smoothly slid in front of him with a pleasant and very fake smile. "Welcome, sir. I'm not looking for a seat at a table or a room," Velik assured her. He pulled out the card Jensen had left in his guild mailbox. "I'm looking for the man who gave me this. Is he still taking rooms here?" The hostess deftly snatched the card from between Velik's fingers and scanned it in an instant. "Indeed, sir. I'd be happy to send any message you'd like up to him." The subtext was clear, even as someone as socially inept as Velik. They'd take a message to their guest, but he wouldn't be going up himself without a clear invitation. Maybe it's the swamp stink in my cloak. Despite the washer lady's best efforts, a faint mustiness still clung to the fabric. He hadn't really noticed it back in Eldmerk, but as soon as he'd gotten a fair distance from the swamp, he'd realized he was taking a piece of it with him. It would probably be upwards of 20,000 dekarmas to get mending added to the cloak on top of all its other enchants, assuming it was even possible, but he was starting to think it was money well spent. If he's here now, just ask him to step out, and I'll meet him on the street. Otherwise, just tell him that Velik is back in town. He knows how to find me. I'm afraid he's away at the moment, but I'll certainly make sure your words reach him," the hostess said. "Now, will there be anything else?" Struggling not to roll his eyes, Velik shook his head. "Thanks," he said. The hostess waited until he was out of the building before muttering, "Tightwad." Velik's hearing was too good not to pick it up, and he belatedly realized she'd been expecting some kind of a tip for running his message up to Jensen. He can pay her for it. Not my fault he picked the most expensive place in the whole city. With no other demands on his attention for the moment, he decided it was a good time to catch a few hours of sleep. As strong as he'd gotten, 3 or 4 would be more than enough. He hadn't dozed in the carriage, unlike Arya, and he was going on 4 days without rest now. Admittedly, other than the Hydra hunt, they hadn't exactly been strenuous days, but he was still happy to find an excuse to close his eyes for a while. Velik made his way back to Melon and Peach, traded a nod with the door bouncer. He'd become familiar to all of them, and they knew that he wasn't a normal customer, so they didn't hassle him when he walked by, without paying, and marched upstairs to the room he'd taken at the far end of the hall. "You're back," one of the girls said when she almost walked into him as she walked out of her room. "I thought you got sick of us. Had a job outside the city. You should just start working here," she told him. "Pays good for a cute rent boy. Oh, don't give me that face." "Fine, just take shifts as a bouncer." "No," Velik said. His room was in a little block with the other bouncers who lived on site, but he had no desire to work their job. If all went well, this would be his last week in Cravel anyway. As soon as Jensen was ready to go, assuming he'd gotten what he wanted from the guild archives, Velik didn't have any plans on coming back. The girl shrugged. "Your loss. It's easy money." She stepped past him, and with a shake of his head, Velik finished the trip to his own room. He hadn't laid down for even 10 minutes when that particularly annoying squealer started up. "I never thought I'd miss sleeping in a hole in the ground, but somehow here I am." Jensen walked past the cat house 3 times before he worked up the nerve to actually go inside. If anyone he knew had seen him entering Melon and Peach, he'd die of shame, but of course this was where Velik was staying. Somehow, did he have something against a Normalin? How did he? Trying to imagine what kind of conversation his socially awkward partner had been forced to endure with the matron was too much for Jensen. He snickered as he walked in, drawing a scowl from the man standing near the door. The guy was close to 6.5 feet tall and muscled heavily enough that Jensen suspected his class put all his physical points directly into his strength. Some sort of labor class, I'd bet. No actual combat training. "Something funny?" the man asked. "No, just looking for a friend of mine." "Yeah, right. Just looking for a friend. In a cat house. I'm sure that's it." "No, really," Jensen insisted. "Don't ask me why he's paying for a room here, but this is where he told me I could find him." "Oh." The man's voice turned flat. "That guy. Tall. Dark hair. The weird thing wrapped around his arm." "That's him," Jensen confirmed. "Yeah, he's here. For some reason. That last part was muttered under the man's breath, but Jensen clearly heard it anyway. Low-level people severely underestimated the senses of people with hunter classes. Jensen hadn't fully appreciated that until a year or so ago, but he caught random strangers talking to themselves all the time now. Sadly, they rarely had anything interesting to say. "Do I just go up?" Jensen asked, waving his hand faintly toward the stairs. "Not unless you got some vitrunes you want to spend." "I'm not looking for companionship," Jensen told him stiffly. "Certainly not here, at least." His eyes tracked a petite blonde as she crossed the bar. "Well, Masha," the man called. A different woman's head snapped up from where she was reclining on a sofa, wearing a form-fitting dress that ended a few inches too soon to be considered decent. "Go tell the brooder he's got a visitor, will you?" "Who'd want to visit that guy?" she returned, but with a shrug, she slid off the sofa and slunk across the room to the stairs in the back. "You keep staring. I'm going to have to charge you anyway," the doorman told Jensen. "I'm not staring." "Sure you're not. Maybe you should turn around and face the wall then." Jensen rolled his eyes and crossed his arms as he settled back to lean against the wall. The doorman squinted at him for a few moments, but then shrugged to himself and went back to a card game he'd been playing with another equally large man. A pair of thick cudgels were leaned up against the wall near them, heavy enough that Jensen had no doubt they'd shatter bone if they hit someone with less than 50 physical. A minute later, Velik came down the stairs. He looked as hostile as ever, like he'd never smiled once in his life and didn't even know how. Considering what Jensen had been told of his childhood and how he'd grown up, that very well could have been true. Deciding not to dwell on it, he exited the cat house without a word, and Velik followed him to the street. They started walking, not with any particular destination in mind, but just because Jensen didn't want to stand in front of Melon and Peach while they talked. "How'd the job go?" Jensen asked. "Quick. Easy," Velik told him. "Now I have to wait to see what the guild thinks." Wasn't he supposed to kill a hydra or something? That's easy for him? I guess it's a good thing, though. I'm only hiring him on for his fighting prowess, and it'll make Shalir happy. I guess you'll be gold ranked soon. Congratulations. It's pretty rare anyone skips bronze and silver in one jump. I guess. Maybe. They've been trying to screw with me, so it might not happen. Jensen wasn't sure why anyone at the Monster Hunters Guild would care about Velik. He was too new to have any political enemies, which probably meant that whatever they were up to didn't concern him so much as he was just collateral damage. Given his utter lack of social graces, it wasn't too hard to picture someone picking him out as the pawn to maneuver without fear of repercussions from a powerful family or allies. "Sorry to hear that," Jensen said. He briefly considered offering to help, but that was something better saved for when he needed Velik to do something he didn't want to do. The young hunter didn't seem like the kind of guy who'd remember he owed Jensen a favor after the fact. "But anyway, what did you want to talk to me about?" He hadn't expected Velik back so soon, not for another week or two at least. Jensen didn't know much about hydras, but they were rightly considered to be among the most difficult of monsters to kill, and finding one in a huge swamp couldn't have been easy. Hopefully, Velik wasn't looking for any updates on how the expedition's prep work was coming along. Things just didn't move that fast when large sums of money were involved, and Jensen had his own politics to navigate through before everything came together. "When do we leave for Slokera?" Damn it. Putting on a congenial front that he certainly didn't feel, Jensen faked a laugh. "Not for a few more weeks. Maybe a month or more. The funding has been secured, but details have to be argued out with the investors, and the Monster Hunters Guild is still assembling its list of people it's sending. Hey, if you could get yourself included on that as the guild's newest gold rank, you could get paid twice for going." Velik seemed to consider that for a second, then shrugged. "Maybe if those responsibilities don't interfere with my own work." Considering the man had taken rooms at a cat house in a relatively poor district, Jensen was a bit surprised that Velik would scoff at double-dipping on a payday. He obviously needed the money, or he wouldn't be doing jobs like Coliseum fighting on the side. He looked like he'd spent everything he'd made from those champion seeds on a fantastic set of gear, which wasn't a terrible investment for a man planning to be a professional monster hunter, but he'd apparently forgotten to leave himself a few thousand dekarmos to live on. "Are you paying me?" Velik asked abruptly. What? Of course I'd be paying you. Well, not me personally. Your wages would be drawn from the expedition's funds. Why would you think I wasn't? The deal was you'd get me over the border attached to your caravan in return for me agreeing to be part of the project, so that fat nobleman would invest in it. We never said anything about paying me. Huh, he's right, now that I think about it. Well, I suppose I don't technically have to, but God save him, he needs some spending money. I guess we haven't discussed it yet, Jensen told him. Like I said, there's still a lot to nail down before we get on the road, but yes, you'll get paid. I could advance you with some now, if you like. Men like Velik had a lot of pride, and Jensen didn't want him to think this was charity. If it was just an advance, that was money Velik would be owed. He'd take it and not feel like Jensen was looking down on him, even though he absolutely was. It wasn't Velik's fault he had no financial literacy. He'd lived in the woods his whole life. Whatever, Velik said. What even is the pay? We'll have to settle on a number. If you play it right to Shalir, I'm betting you could get 300 dekarmos, maybe 4. I could advance you 100 now. You could buy a decent pair of clothes and find somewhere classier to stay, so I don't have to be seen here and you don't get turned away at the door of the Crystal Monocle. If you want. Jensen frowned. Not the reaction I was expecting. You don't seem to care. It's not very much money, Velik said. I don't care about a few hundred dekarmos. If you can get things moving a day faster, use the money for that instead. I want to leave Cravel as soon as possible, preferably before I have to go attend a meeting with a bunch of people whose faces I want to punch. Not very much money, Jensen repeated. I mean, I agree. It's not that much. But if that's what you think, then why in the hells are you dressed like that and sleeping at Melon and Peach? No. Actually, is there anything I can do to speed this up? Do you need more money? Or some errands run? What is happening right now? No, thank you. The meetings are all set up. We just got to finalize the destination, hire on a monster hunters and the wagon crew, and rent the storage box. And I've got to somehow convince 4 different people that we need to go to somewhere in Slokera instead of wherever they want to go, but you don't need to know about that part. Extra-dimensional storage? Velik asked, perking up. I was looking into that, but it was quite expensive. It will be one of the biggest expenses of the entire trip, but it simplifies logistics and gives us a safe way to transport back whatever we find in the vault, Jensen said. Eventually, I'll have enough to buy 1 outright, maybe even after this first trip if things go exceptionally well. More likely, it'll be 2 or 3. Then I won't have to jump through all these hoops to get things moving. Doesn't help with this one, though, Velik muttered. Damn, I'm going to have to go to that meeting after all. All right, I guess it gives me some time to take care of other business. Keep me updated and let me know if you need my help with anything. Sure, Jensen agreed easily. There really wasn't much of anything someone like Velik could do beyond what he'd already done, though admittedly, securing the lion's share of the expedition's funding was a pretty important contribution. If that's all, I've got some meetings of my own to see to. Right, Velik said. He sighed and shook his head. Not ideal. Oh well. Thanks, Jensen. You're welcome, Velik.